Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. When the sun ruled the day, life by shadow and season. Before clocks existed, time did not tick. It did not march forward in equal steps. It stretched and shrank, bent itself around daylight, weather, and the human body. If you were alive in this world, you would not ask what time it was. Instead, you would look up, squint slightly, and ask where the sun sat in the sky. Time was something you sensed rather than measured, something you felt in your bones long before you tried to explain it. You wake not to an alarm, but to light. The pale gray of dawn filters through a doorway or a slit in the wall. Birds begin their habitual noise, and somewhere nearby an animal shifts in its sleep. Your body wakes because it always has. There is no urgency. No one expects you at a precise minute. The day begins when it begins. In ancient agrarian societies from Mesopotamia to early Egypt, from Neolithic Europe to the Indus Valley, this was how time worked. The sun rose and work followed. The sun reached its highest point and the body slowed. The sun fell and activity retreated with it. Time was inseparable from labor, and labor was inseparable from survival. You would experience the day as a sequence of natural signals. Morning meant cooler air and stiff muscles. Midday meant heat pressing down, shadows shrinking beneath your feet. Evening meant lengthening darkness and the smell of smoke as fires were lit for cooking. These were not poetic descriptions to you, they were instructions. Each change told you what could or could not be done. The concept of an hour technically existed in some early civilizations, but it did not mean what it means to you now. In ancient Egypt, daylight was divided into 12 parts and night into 12 parts, but these hours changed length depending on the season. Summer hours were long, winter hours were short. Time itself breathed with the year. You did not live inside a rigid grid of minutes. You lived inside a living system. This mattered because everything depended on timing. Crops had to be planted when the ground was ready, not when a calendar said so. Animals had to be moved before heat or cold made it dangerous. Journeys were planned by daylight, not distance. You could not travel far after sunset unless you knew the land intimately, and even then it was risky. Without clocks, memory became a timekeeping tool. You remembered when something usually happened. The flood came after the star rose. The harvest followed the long days. The rains returned when the air smelled different. In Mesopotamia, the rising of certain stars marked agricultural tasks. In Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius signaled the coming Nile flood. The sky was not decoration, it was a schedule. If you lived then, your sense of the future would be different. You would not think in weeks or months in the abstract. You would think in events. After the flood, before the harvest, when the lambs are born, time was anchored to change, not to numbers. This also meant that waiting felt different. Waiting was not counted, it was endured. If you were waiting for a traveler to return, you did not know whether it had been 3 days or 5. You knew only whether the food stores were shrinking. If you were waiting for a child to be born, there was no countdown. Birth arrived when it arrived, and that uncertainty was accepted as normal. Even social life bent around this flexible time. Gatherings happened when people were free, not at fixed appointments. Storytelling filled long evenings because there was nothing else to do once darkness came. Sleep itself was segmented. Historical evidence suggests many pre-industrial societies practiced first sleep and second sleep, waking for a period in the middle of the night before sleeping again. Without clocks, this was not strange. Night was simply another landscape to move through. You would also notice how authority functioned differently. Without precise time, control was looser. A leader could demand labor, but not at 7:00 a.m. sharp. Religious rituals happened at dawn or dusk, not at exact minutes. Power existed, but it did not yet command time with precision. Still, time controlled you, even if invisibly. Seasons decided whether you ate or starved. Daylight decided how much work you could do, weather erased plans without apology. You were free from schedules but not from nature's discipline. Consider the psychological effect. Without constant reminders of passing minutes, life likely felt slower but also more fragile. You could not rush a season. You could not compress effort into late hours with artificial light. Mistakes lingered longer. Miss a planting window, and the entire year suffered. Yet there was also elasticity. If the morning was lost to rain, the afternoon adjusted. If work finished early, rest followed without guilt. Productivity was measured by completion, not by duration. This kind of time required attention. You had to notice things: the angle of the sun, the feel of the wind, the length of shadows on familiar stones. Over years, this awareness became instinct. You did not need to calculate time, you embodied it. As civilizations grew larger, this natural time began to strain. Coordinating hundreds or thousands of people without shared precision created friction. Trade expanded. Cities formed. Rituals multiplied. Slowly, humans began to seek ways to divide the day more clearly, not to free themselves from time, but to tame it. But before that transformation, before gears and bells and ticking mechanisms, you lived in a world where time flowed like weather, predictable, yet never exact. And as simple as this system seems, it quietly shaped every decision you made, every risk you took, and every hope you carried into the next season. The question is not whether life was easier without clocks. The question is what was lost and what was gained when humans decided that time should no longer move at the pace of the sun, but at the pace of a machine. As societies grew more complex, the quiet flexibility of natural time began to face subtle pressure. You can imagine it first as a mild inconvenience rather than a crisis. A village expands into a town. A town becomes a city. More people means more coordination, and coordination slowly demands agreement. Agreement about when something begins, when it ends, when it is too late. Without clocks, people turned to shared reference points. These were not numbers, but events and objects that everyone could see or hear. Time became communal rather than personal. One of the earliest tools you would encounter is the shadow. A vertical stick planted in the ground, what we now call a gnomon, casts a shadow that moves predictably throughout the day. Long in the morning, shortest at midday, stretching again toward evening. You do not need to know mathematics to use it. You simply learn its behavior through repetition. When the shadow touches that stone, it is time to eat. When it reaches the edge of the courtyard, it is time to stop working. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, such shadow devices became standard features of temples and administrative centers. They were not used by everyone, but by those whose roles required coordination: priests, officials, overseers of labor. These devices did not give you a universal time. They gave you a local rhythm. A cloudy day could still disrupt everything. Water offered another solution. The clepsydra, or water clock, measured time by the steady flow of liquid from one container to another. You might encounter it in a courtroom where speeches needed limits, or in a temple where rituals followed precise sequences. But even this was imperfect. Water flows faster in heat, slower in cold. The device demanded constant attention, refilling, adjustment, and interpretation. What matters here is not accuracy, but intention. For the first time, time was being separated from the sky. It was no longer entirely external. Humans were attempting to hold it, to trap it briefly in containers and shadows. If you lived during this transitional period, your experience of time would be uneven. Most of your life still followed natural cues. You rose with light, slept with darkness, worked when conditions allowed. But certain moments, rituals, judgments, official duties now asked for more precision. You would feel the difference. Time was no longer only something you followed. It was something that could be enforced. Religion played a significant role in this shift. Many early civilizations tied specific prayers or offerings to particular moments of the day. Not sometime in the morning, but closer to dawn. Not simply at night, but when darkness fully settled. This created a demand for better time awareness, especially among religious specialists. In ancient Rome, public life depended on such signals. The day was divided into hours, but these hours still expanded and contracted with the seasons. A summer hour was longer than a winter one. Noon was marked when the sun crossed its highest point, and officials would announce it publicly. Legal proceedings, markets, and political gatherings followed this announcement. You did not need to own a device. You needed to be within earshot. Sound became a tool of time. Bells, horns, and shouted announcements cut through daily noise to tell you something had shifted. This is an important change. Visual cues require attention. Sound demands obedience. You may not be watching the sky, but you cannot ignore a bell. Yet even now, time was not abstract. It was always tied to purpose. There was no reason to know the hour unless something depended on it. Time was still relational, not universal. For ordinary people, especially those working the land, these developments barely touched daily life. You still judged your progress by the task, not the duration. Fields were plowed until they were finished or until light failed. Meals happened when hunger demanded them. Rest came when exhaustion arrived. But in cities, a quiet divide began to form. Those who controlled schedules gained influence. If you could declare when the day officially began, you could shape labor. If you decided when courts opened, you controlled justice. Timekeeping, even in its crude forms, began to carry authority. This authority was fragile. Weather disrupted it. Seasonal changes distorted it. Devices failed. People argued about interpretations. Time was still negotiable. And because it was negotiable, it remained deeply human. Disputes were settled through conversation. Delays were expected. Flexibility was built into the system. You would also notice how patience functioned differently. Without precise deadlines, urgency was rare. Tasks took as long as they took. A journey was measured in sunrises, not hours. You did not calculate arrival times. You prepared for uncertainty. This uncertainty shaped behavior. Travelers carried extra supplies. Communities stored surplus. Social bonds mattered because you relied on others when plans failed. Time's unpredictability encouraged resilience rather than efficiency. Children grew up absorbing this rhythm without instruction. They learned when it was late by the color of the sky. They learned when it was too early by the chill in the air. Aging itself felt different. Without birthdays counted precisely, life stages blurred. You were young, then not young. Old age arrived gradually, not on a number. And yet, pressure continued to build. Trade expanded beyond local regions. Armies needed coordination. Religious institutions grew larger and more demanding. The idea that time could be standardized, shared across distance, began to take hold. You can sense the tension here. Natural time was forgiving but imprecise. Emerging measured time promised order but threatened flexibility. The world was not yet ready to choose, but the choice was approaching. As shadows and water continued their quiet work, humans stood on the edge of a transformation they did not fully understand. They were learning not just how to measure time, but how to obey it. And the question that lingered, unspoken but growing stronger, was this. Once time could be measured more precisely, who would be allowed to control it and who would be forced to live by it? The transition did not arrive as a single moment. There was no day when people woke and discovered that time had hardened into something strict and mechanical. Instead, it crept forward in small, almost forgettable changes. A bell rung a little earlier. A ritual fixed more firmly. A task no longer allowed to wait for better light or weather. Over generations, flexibility narrowed and few noticed what was being traded away. If you lived at the edge of this change, you might still believe that the sun ruled your day. But increasingly, the sun was being interpreted for you. In growing towns, religious institutions took on the responsibility of announcing time. Monasteries, mosques, and temples needed regularity. Prayer had to happen not just daily, but in an ordered sequence. In Christian Europe, canonical hours structured the monastic day. Matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These divisions were not suggestions. They were obligations. To keep them, monks relied on observation, memory, and eventually, devices. Water clocks ticked quietly in cloisters. Sand slipped through glass in measured streams. Night watches counted candles burned down to known lengths. Time was still imperfect, but it was becoming disciplined. You would feel this discipline most clearly in communal life. Bells rang not only to signal prayer, but to tell you when to work, when to rest, when to gather. In medieval towns, the sound of a bell could reach farther than any shouted announcement. It did not ask for your attention. It demanded it. At first, these signals aligned closely with natural cues. Morning bells rang near sunrise. Evening bells followed sunset. But over time, consistency mattered more than alignment. People began to trust the bell more than the sky. If the bell said it was time, then it was time even if the light felt wrong. This was the turning point. Time began to exist outside your body. For laborers, this shift was subtle but profound. Work that once ended when exhaustion set in now ended when the signal sounded. Rest that once followed completion now waited for permission. The measure of a good day changed. It was no longer about what you finished, but whether you followed the schedule. Still, resistance lingered. Agricultural life remained stubbornly tied to natural rhythms. Crops did not care about bells. Animals did not respond to hours. In rural areas, flexible time survived much longer. But cities, with their density and complexity, became laboratories for stricter time. The first mechanical clocks appeared in Europe in the late Middle Ages, often installed in church towers. They were inaccurate by modern standards, sometimes drifting by minutes or hours. But accuracy was not the point. Visibility was. For the first time, time was displayed publicly, continuously, and authoritatively. You could look up and see it. More importantly, everyone else could see it too. This shared reference changed behavior. Meetings could be coordinated. Markets could open and close reliably. Curfews could be enforced. Time became a tool of governance. And yet, for ordinary people, the adjustment was uneasy. You might feel anxiety you could not name, a sense that the day was no longer yours to interpret. That lateness had become a moral failing, not a natural occurrence. Sleep patterns shifted. Segmented sleep began to disappear as nights were compressed to fit work schedules. Artificial light extended productive hours. Darkness lost its authority. Waiting, once an accepted condition of life, became inefficiency. Slowness became something to apologize for. The loss was not immediate, but it was cumulative. The old world of seasonal patience and bodily intuition faded quietly. In its place, emerged a world that valued synchronization over sensation. And yet something remained. Even now, beneath the clocks and schedules, your body still responds to light. Fatigue still follows effort. Seasons still shape mood and health. The ancient relationship with time was never fully erased, only buried. When you feel restless at night or sluggish in winter mornings, you are touching that older system. When productivity feels unnatural, you are sensing a conflict that began centuries ago. The people who lived before clocks did not romanticize their world. It was hard, uncertain, often cruel, but their relationship with time was adaptive rather than rigid. Time served life, not the other way around. As mechanical time spread, it brought undeniable benefits: coordination, safety, technological progress. But it also demanded obedience. Time became something you could waste, save, lose. The sun still rises, shadows still move, but you rarely notice them. The question that remains is not whether clocks were a mistake. It is whether remembering older rhythms might soften the grip of a system that never stops counting, and whether, in a world ruled by minutes, there is still room to live by the light. Story 2. Bells Without Clocks: How Medieval Europe Kept Time by Sound. If you lived in a medieval European town before mechanical clocks became common, you would not look up to know the time. You would listen. Sound, not sight, organized your day. Bells were the most powerful technology of timekeeping most people ever encountered, and their influence reached far beyond religion. They structured work, rest, obedience, fear, and safety. Long before clocks measured minutes, bells measured behavior. You wake not because the sun has risen, but because a low, familiar sound rolls across rooftops and narrow streets. It is not loud enough to startle you, but it is impossible to ignore. The bell does not ask whether you are ready. It simply announces that something has changed. In medieval Europe, especially between the 9th and 14th centuries, bells were everywhere. Churches, monasteries, city gates, watchtowers, and even some marketplaces relied on bells to mark time. For most people, this was the only shared time reference they had. You likely do not own a timekeeping device. You may not even know how to read, but you understand the bells. You know their tones, rhythms, and meanings. One pattern means prayer, another means danger, another means the workday has begun. This system worked because sound travels. In a world without amplified noise, a large bell could reach an entire town. Its voice carried over walls, fields, and rivers. It unified people who could not see one another and who lived very different lives. The church bell was usually the most important. Monasteries had long used bells to regulate the canonical hours, but as towns grew around churches, this religious schedule spilled into secular life. Even if you were not deeply religious, the bell still told you when to wake, when to pause, when to stop. You do not know the hour. You know that it is after prime or before vespers. Time is still relational, but it is no longer personal. It is shared. The experience of time becomes auditory. You associate moments of the day with sound rather than light. The day feels punctuated rather than continuous. Silence and sound divide it into usable pieces. For laborers, this mattered deeply. Work often began with a bell and ended with one. In some towns, fines were imposed for working past the evening bell, especially during seasons when night work was considered dangerous or sinful. Rest was enforced not by exhaustion, but by sound. This enforcement was not always gentle. Bells were instruments of authority. When a bell rang, it meant someone with power had decided something. The church, the town council, the Lord, whoever controlled the bell, controlled the rhythm of daily life. You might resent this quietly, but you also depend on it. Bells warn of fire. They signal approaching enemies. They announce executions, assemblies, emergencies. In moments of danger, the bell becomes the town's voice, calling you to act. Because of this, bells carried emotional weight. Certain sounds made your body tense instantly. Others brought relief. Over time, you learned to respond without thinking. The bell trained you. Night was especially shaped by sound. Without street lighting, darkness was dangerous. Cities enforced curfews marked by bells. Once the bell rang, gates closed, taverns shut. Fires were extinguished or carefully controlled. Being outside after the bell could make you suspect. You might still be awake, but you are meant to be still. Time at night became something you obeyed rather than experienced. The bell did not care whether you were tired or not. It declared what was allowed. This auditory timekeeping also erased individuality. Everyone heard the same signal. There was no private interpretation. If you missed a bell, it was your fault. Excuses were harder to justify when the entire town heard the same sound. And yet bells were not precise. They did not ring at exact intervals measured by machinery. They were rung by people. A sexton climbed a tower, pulled a rope, judged the moment by experience and habit. Weather, fatigue, and error all played roles. This human element mattered. It meant time was still negotiable. Bells could be delayed. Extra rings could be added. Silence could stretch if needed. But the trend was clear. Time was becoming external, shared, and increasingly compulsory. For children growing up in this environment, bells were as natural as birdsong. They learned early what each sound meant. Fear, duty, rest, all encoded in sound. The bell did not explain itself. It did not persuade. It announced. And as towns grew louder and more crowded, this system became essential. Without it, coordination would fail. Markets would dissolve into chaos. Defenses would weaken. Bells solved problems that natural time could not. But they also changed how people felt about time. The day was no longer something you moved through freely. It was something that happened to you in segments, announced by force. You did not watch time pass. You waited for it to call you. And this raises an unsettling question. Once time can summon you with sound, how long before it begins to command you with something even stronger? To understand medieval timekeeping, you must stop thinking of bells as neutral instruments. They were not passive markers of the day. They were tools of power, shaped by human hands and rung with intention. Every bell had an owner, and every owner had priorities. If you lived in a medieval town, you would know exactly who controlled the bell. It was usually the church, sometimes the town council, occasionally a lord or guild. Whoever held that authority shaped your daily rhythm, often without speaking to you directly. The bell did not explain itself. It did not argue, it declared. This mattered because medieval life depended on predictability, but not precision. Bells provided predictability without needing clocks. They told you when something should happen, even if they did not tell you exactly what time it was. You might notice that the bell rang earlier in winter and later in summer, following daylight loosely rather than mechanically. This flexibility allowed the system to survive without breaking against the seasons. But it also meant that time could be adjusted quietly, without announcement. If labor needed to start earlier, the bell rang earlier. If a festival demanded longer rest, the bell waited. Time was malleable in the hands of those who rang it. This gave bells political significance. In disputes between towns and churches, control of bells was often contested. There are recorded conflicts where towns demanded the right to ring their own bells independently of religious authorities. To ring a bell was to claim jurisdiction over time itself. In some cities, guilds were granted permission to ring bells for their members. These bells signaled work hours, meetings, or emergencies within a trade. You could hear the hierarchy of the town layered in sound. The church bell above all, then civic bells, then guild bells, each with its own authority and reach. If you listened closely, you could tell who mattered. Bells also enforced moral order. Certain activities were permitted only between specific bells. Gambling, drinking, or noisy work after curfew could result in punishment. The bell transformed time into law. You did not need a watch to be guilty. You needed only to be heard or seen breaking the rules after the sound had passed. This enforcement created a new relationship between time and guilt. Before bells, lateness was relative. After bells, it became a transgression. You were no longer simply late, you were disobedient. The emotional weight of bells grew heavier during times of crisis. When fire broke out, the alarm bell rang differently, faster, louder, more urgent. You learned to distinguish these patterns instinctively. Your body reacted before your mind caught up. During plagues, bells tolled constantly for the dead. In some towns, the sound became so frequent that it blurred into the background, a grim rhythm marking mass death. Time during epidemics felt distorted, stretched by grief and repetition. Bells also shaped memory. You remembered events by the sound that accompanied them. The bell that rang when your father died, the bell that announced a wedding, the bell that called men to arms. Time was not counted, it was remembered acoustically. At night, bells were especially powerful. Night watches relied on bells to mark their rounds. A guard would call out the hour, not a number, but a phrase sometimes accompanied by a bell or rattle. This reassured sleepers that someone was awake, that order persisted in darkness. If you heard no sound for too long, anxiety grew. Silence could mean danger. This dependence on sound created vulnerability. Storms could muffle bells. Strong winds could carry them away from intended listeners. During war, enemies sometimes targeted bell towers, not just for strategic reasons but psychological ones. Silencing the bell meant disrupting the town's sense of order. In some sieges, bells were melted down for weapons. This was not just resource extraction, it was symbolic. Time itself was being sacrificed to survival. As mechanical clocks slowly began to appear, bells did not disappear. Instead, they changed function. The bell became the voice of the clock, translating invisible mechanisms into sound the town could hear. This made time feel even more external. You no longer trusted the judgment of a sexton watching the sky. You trusted gears hidden in stone towers. Yet for a long time, people still experienced time primarily through hearing. The clock face was often too high or too far away to read. The bell remained the interface between human life and measured time. What is striking is how little choice you had. You could not opt out of bell time. Even if you lived at the edge of town, sound reached you. Time entered your home whether you wanted it or not. This created a shared reality, but also a shared submission. And slowly, imperceptibly, people began to internalize it. You did not wait for hunger, you waited for the bell. You did not rest when tired, you rested when allowed. Over time, the bell's rhythm became your own. The question that lingered was not whether bells were useful, they clearly were, but whether something fundamental was changing in how humans understood their relationship to time. When time speaks to you with authority, and you learn to obey it without question, what happens when that authority becomes even more precise, more constant, and impossible to ignore? By the late Middle Ages, the bell no longer merely marked time, it enforced it. If you stood in a town square during this period, you would feel how deeply sound had settled into the structure of daily life. The bell did not simply accompany events, it authorized them. Without its signal, actions felt unofficial, even improper. Time had acquired a voice, and that voice carried consequences. This transformation happened gradually, as most profound changes do. Bells had always been important, but now they were synchronized with emerging mechanical clocks. These clocks were hidden inside towers, large, unreliable, expensive machines that few understood. What mattered was not how they worked, but that they rang consistently. For the first time, time was no longer interpreted by human judgment alone. It was produced. You might still believe you were living by sound, but the sound was now governed by gears. The bell rang not because someone decided it was the right moment, but because a mechanism said so. This distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. With this shift, time became less negotiable. If you were late, it was no longer because the morning stretched or the weather delayed you. It was because you failed to obey. The bell had spoken. The clock had decided. Responsibility shifted from the environment to the individual. This change reshaped work. In workshops and early manufactories, bells increasingly regulated labor. Work began when the bell rang, paused when it rang again, and ended the same way. Payment became tied not only to output but to presence. You did not need to finish your task. You needed to be there when the sound occurred. This was a quiet redefinition of value. Time itself became something that could be owned, sold, and lost. If you arrived late, you lost time. If you lingered after hours, you stole it. The bell transformed from a communal guide into a disciplinary tool. Cities codified this power into law. Ordinances specified activities allowed between certain bells. Curfews were enforced more strictly. Nighttime movement required permission. The bell's authority extended into private life, shaping when you slept, when you ate, when you were expected to be still. Even joy followed the bell. Festivals began and ended with sound. Silence marked mourning. Excessive noise outside sanctioned times could bring punishment. Sound itself became regulated, reinforcing time's control. And still, most people accepted this system. Bells provided safety, order, and predictability. In crowded towns, these were not luxuries. Fires spread quickly. Crime thrived in darkness. Knowing when to act together mattered. But something subtle had changed in how people understood themselves. Time was no longer something you moved through with awareness. It was something that acted upon you. The bell told you when you were late, when you were allowed, when you were wrong. Children grew up internalizing this structure. They learned to anticipate the bell, to adjust their behavior before it sounded. Eventually, they no longer needed to hear it to feel its presence. The rhythm lived inside them. This internalization was crucial. It meant that control no longer required constant enforcement. People disciplined themselves. The bell also altered how people remembered the past. Events became associated not only with seasons or circumstances, but with specific times. Before the bell and after the bell replaced older, looser markers, memory tightened. And yet, for all this rigidity, medieval bell time remained incomplete. It could not divide the hour finely. It could not follow individuals beyond earshot. It could not synchronize distant places precisely. Those limitations would not last. As trade expanded and cities connected, the desire for uniform time grew stronger. Bells alone could not satisfy it. Mechanical clocks improved. Faces were added. Minutes emerged. Seconds waited quietly in the future. The bell had prepared people for obedience. It had taught them to listen, to respond, to structure their lives around external signals. When clocks finally became personal, when time moved from tower to pocket, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. Looking back, bells were not just a solution to medieval coordination. They were a training ground. They taught humans to live by shared time, to accept authority embedded in rhythm, and to surrender flexibility in exchange for order. Even now, when a notification chime interrupts your thoughts, you are responding to a distant descendant of the medieval bell. The sound still demands attention. The habit still lingers. The people who first lived under bell time did not know they were rehearsing for a future ruled by precision. They believed they were simply organizing their days. But in learning to hear time and obey it, they helped build a world where time would eventually speak constantly, silently, and without mercy. And that leaves one lingering question. Once time no longer needed a bell to be heard, how much control would it demand? Story 3. Roman hours that changed length, a day that was never the same. If you lived in ancient Rome, your day would be measured not in fixed hours, but in shadows and the movement of the sun. Roman timekeeping was fundamentally different from anything we take for granted today. The day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, but these hours were not equal. Summer hours stretched long. Winter hours shrank. The same hour could be as short as 45 minutes in December or as long as 75 minutes in June. You would not wear a watch, nor would anyone you know. You would rely on the position of the sun and the length of shadows to structure your life. A gnomon, a simple vertical stick casting a shadow, could give you a rough indication of the time, but precision was unnecessary for most of your daily activities. Instead, you moved through a rhythm dictated by daylight, human need, and the expectations of society. Your morning likely began with light spilling across the atrium of your domus, the central courtyard of your Roman house. Slaves would stir first, fetching water, preparing fires, and tending to household animals. You rose to join them, not at a fixed hour, but when the day demanded it. Breakfast was simple: a piece of bread, some fruit, a cup of watered wine taken quickly before the heat of the day set in. Work and social obligations followed. Farmers would labor in fields, adjusting their efforts to the sun. Artisans and merchants opened shops as light allowed. Meetings in the forum, legal proceedings, and religious ceremonies were all scheduled relative to daylight and social expectation, not an absolute hour. The forum itself would swell with life in the late morning, as people took advantage of the sun to see and be seen. Interestingly, even the elite lived with a form of temporal flexibility. Wealthy Romans had more control over their daily routine, but the structure of society still influenced them. Baths, for instance, were scheduled based on crowds and heat, not a precise timetable. Political life, too, was governed by assemblies and meetings that began when enough participants arrived rather than a fixed number of minutes past sunrise. Nighttime was equally elastic. Darkness, unlike the measured hours of day, was treated as a span rather than a strict sequence. Oil lamps provided limited illumination, so activity slowed naturally. Families gathered around small fires. Slaves completed chores under faint light. Travel after dark was dangerous and generally avoided. Time was also tied to festivals and religious observances. Roman religious life was dense with rituals, many of which were timed according to the position of the sun. Certain sacrifices had to occur at precise moments, midday for some, dawn for others, but even these precise times were approximate, interpreted through observation rather than measured instruments. This system required that Romans be deeply attuned to nature. You learned to read the sky, notice wind patterns, and observe animal behavior. The crowing of a rooster, the angle of shadows, and the warmth of the sun became signals guiding your actions. You did not need to calculate, you simply adjusted. Travel, however, exposed the limitations of this approach. If you moved from one town to another, local perceptions of time differed. 12 daylight hours in Rome might feel different in the northern provinces, where summer days were much longer. Merchants and soldiers had to adapt, learning that midday was relative, not absolute. The social implications were significant. The flexibility of time meant that punctuality was a cultural expectation, not a mechanical one. Being on time required understanding and respect for natural rhythms, as well as an awareness of local custom. A visitor unfamiliar with the local solar hours could inadvertently offend, appearing lazy or disrespectful simply by misjudging the sun. Even labor was negotiated relative to daylight. Agricultural work depended on both season and weather. A plowman might begin early in summer to avoid the hottest hours, yet in winter the same task could be squeezed into shorter periods of light. Hours expanded and contracted like an elastic band, stretching life to fit the demands of the environment. For the average Roman citizen, these variations shape perception itself. You might notice that the day feels longer in summer, not just because of heat or activity, but because each hour literally takes longer. Conversely, winter compresses time, making tasks feel hurried and sleep arrive sooner. Life, measured in these shifting units, encouraged adaptability and patience, qualities that modern schedules often neglect. Rome's method of measuring time also reflected a deeply human connection to the cosmos. Hours were not abstract numbers but living segments of the day, tied to sunrise, zenith, and sunset. To live effectively, you had to anticipate changes in light and adjust your behavior accordingly. There was a constant, quiet negotiation with the environment. Yet this system had weaknesses. Large public events, coordinated across distances, often struggled. Soldiers marching in distant provinces could not rely on local solar hours to coordinate with commanders far away. Trade that spanned regions with differing daylight hours introduced confusion. And as the Roman Empire expanded, the need for more standardized temporal coordination began to grow. Still, for most people, life remained measured by observation rather than by mechanism. You knew the time because you felt it: the heat of the sun, the length of shadows, the fatigue in your muscles. You lived inside the day rather than observing it from outside. And so, even as the Roman state developed calendars, sundials, and rudimentary mechanical devices, most Romans moved through life guided by experience and natural cues. Hours were flexible, but survival depended on respecting them. Missing the subtle rhythms of daylight could mean physical exhaustion, crop failure, or social embarrassment. As night fell and you prepared to rest, you might pause to notice how differently time behaves depending on the season. A winter sunset arrives quickly, compressing the day into fewer hours. A summer sunset lingers, extending labor, leisure, and conversation. Your life, in subtle ways, bends with the solar cycle, shaping perception, expectation, and habit. And yet, even in this fluid system, the seeds of conflict with the future are present. What happens when humans eventually seek to measure time evenly, rather than letting it follow the sun? How do you adjust when hours no longer expand and contract with the seasons? The Romans lived on the edge of this question without knowing it. They embodied a rhythm that was at once natural and disciplinary, flexible yet unavoidable. And as we look back, we can begin to see how the struggle between human schedules and natural time would shape civilizations for centuries to come. In the streets and villas of Rome, life was still guided primarily by observation of the sun. But as the city and its empire grew, people began to crave more precision. A farmer could work by the sun, yes, but magistrates, traders, and religious officials needed something more consistent. The solution: sundials and other solar instruments, modest tools that promised to bring order to the flowing, elastic hours of daylight. A sundial is deceptively simple. A vertical stick or triangular gnomon casts a shadow on a marked surface. The shadow moves throughout the day, and by observing it, you can roughly tell how far the day has progressed. In theory, sundials allow for measurement of time with greater specificity than naked observation. In practice, they are less precise than they seem. Clouds, dust, and human error introduce variation, and even a perfect sundial only works where it is calibrated correctly for latitude. Still, for Romans, sundials were revolutionary. By the 3rd century BCE, portable and public sundials appeared in city squares, temples, and private homes. You could now see time in a more standardized way than merely watching shadows shift. Wealthy citizens took pride in owning sundials, often engraved with poetic sayings about the fleeting nature of life. Public sundials reinforced civic order. A trial might be said to begin at the 3rd hour, but this hour was now more consistently marked, even if it still stretched in summer or shrank in winter. The effect on daily life was subtle but profound. You began to think of the day as divisible, measurable, something you could track beyond intuition. Tasks could be planned around the movement of shadows. Work hours were less elastic. Social coordination became easier. A merchant could promise delivery by the 6th hour, and while the 6th hour was still longer in summer than in winter, it had a tangible reference. The sun, once an abstract indicator of progression, became a quasi-objective measure. Yet sundials did not eliminate ambiguity. They measured daylight only, leaving nighttime largely unstructured. Festivals, religious observances, and watch rotations at night still depended on experience, memory, and judgment. Travelers and soldiers needed other methods. Water clocks or clepsydras provided one solution. By letting water flow steadily from one vessel to another, people could measure intervals even when the sun was gone. These devices, however, required constant attention. Water flow varies with temperature and pressure. Maintenance was tedious. The Roman reliance on clepsydras was limited to specialized contexts, law courts, astronomy, and elite households. Even with sundials and clepsydras, the very concept of an hour remained elastic. The Romans understood that daylight hours lengthened in summer and shortened in winter. If you lived in Rome during midsummer, your 6th hour might be nearly twice as long as your 6th hour in midwinter. This system made intuitive sense. You work with light, not against it, but it also meant that standardized coordination across seasons was impossible. This elasticity shaped human behavior. Romans adapted naturally to seasonal variation. Laborers adjusted work pace according to daylight. Merchants and officials internalized the rhythm of expanding and contracting hours. Patience and flexibility were as valuable as punctuality. If you misjudged the sun, The consequences were mostly practical missed labor, delayed markets not moral or legal. Yet there were tensions. Political life demanded more rigid coordination. Senate meetings, legal hearings, and military operations could not rely solely on shifting hours. Efforts to standardize time through sundials or clepsydras were attempts to bridge human perception with administrative necessity. Officials often issued instructions tied to the hour, as measured by sundials. Guards and watchmen adjusted their rounds accordingly. Time, while still tied to nature, was slowly acquiring the trappings of measurement. This process created a subtle internalization of time. Citizens began to anticipate hours. A public speaker would conclude a speech before the 6th hour's shadow reached its mark. Merchants adjusted shop hours to the sundial's readings. Children learned to associate certain activities with the sun's position rather than random cues. Life became simultaneously natural and regimented, balancing human intuition with emerging measurement. Travel highlighted the limits of Roman timekeeping. Daylight hours varied with latitude. A journey from Rome to the northern provinces altered perception of the day. 6th hour in Rome might be markedly different from 6th hour in Gaul. Soldiers marching along the Rhine had to recalibrate their schedules constantly. Merchants moving grain or olive oil across the empire experienced disorientation as daylight hours shifted. Without uniform time, coordination remained a challenge. Despite imperfections, sundials and clepsydras prepared the ground for the next stage of temporal development. They familiarized humans with the idea that time could be observed, measured, and anticipated beyond bodily experience. They created a psychological shift. Time was no longer just a backdrop, it was becoming a resource, something you could track and attempt to control. Even in domestic life, the effect was profound. Wealthy Romans set meals, baths, and study periods according to sundial readings. Slaves adjusted their routines accordingly. Leisure, ritual, and work were gradually synchronized with measured hours. Your body and habits began to adapt, preparing you unconsciously for the stricter, mechanical time that would arrive centuries later. And yet, despite these innovations, Roman hours remained fundamentally dependent on nature. No sundial could make summer hours the same length as winter hours. No clepsydra could perfectly counteract environmental variation. Time remained both measured and lived, both external and intimate. This duality shaped Roman life, teaching flexibility while nudging society toward standardization. It instilled an early awareness that time could be a tool, not just a passive experience. Citizens learned that timing influenced success in politics, trade, military operations, and daily survival. But the questions lingered. How do you reconcile human perception with mechanical measurement? How do you prepare a society for clocks that will insist on uniformity, minute by minute, when the natural world refuses to comply? Romans lived at the edge of this tension, adapting to hours that changed with the sun, even as they began experimenting with ways to make hours more predictable. They were learning, without realizing it, that time could be observed, harnessed, and eventually controlled. By the time of the late Roman Republic and early Empire, the elasticity of hours had become a subtle, yet pervasive force in daily life. You lived not by fixed minutes, but by relative segments of daylight and darkness. The 6th hour of summer was long, the same hour in winter short. What does this mean for how you structure your day, your work, your obligations, and even your expectations of others? For farmers, the answer was practical. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, these tasks followed the sun's lead. The laborer adjusted to light and shadow, responding to the day itself rather than an abstract measurement. A long summer day allowed for extended toil, yet the heat forced midday rest. Winter's short hours constrained activity, making efficiency vital. Your perception of effort was inseparable from daylight. For urban Romans, the challenge was more psychological. You were expected to attend markets, forums, and social engagements according to nominal hours. But these hours stretched and shrank with the seasons. You had to internalize the sun's movements, anticipate the varying lengths of time, and align your actions with social expectation. Missing an event was not simply a matter of oversight, it could signal ignorance of natural rhythm, lack of civic awareness, or even disrespect. The wealthy, whose lives were less physically tethered to the land, relied heavily on sundials. The public sundial, often placed in a forum or a private atrium, became a social instrument. You checked it not just for timing, but as a way to demonstrate order, sophistication, and awareness of communal rhythm. Sundials, etched with poetic inscriptions about life's fleeting nature, reminded citizens that even measured hours were temporary, bending with the sun. For political and military operations, these shifting hours were a constant obstacle. Armies could not march strictly by a fixed hour, for day length varied drastically with season and latitude. Campaigns, supply movements, and coordinated attacks required deep understanding of solar progression. Generals and soldiers alike had to master flexible time, learning to read shadows and anticipate daylight for operational planning. Even in legal life, the Roman system of hours influenced proceedings. Trials and court sessions were scheduled by daylight divisions. A hearing set for the third hour might take longer in summer, shorter in winter. Lawyers, magistrates, and participants needed an intuitive grasp of time's variability to prepare adequately. Missing the subtle cues could disrupt proceedings and diminish authority. This environment fostered resilience, adaptability, and acute observational skill. Time was not an abstract adversary measured by ticking gears. It was a living rhythm to negotiate. You learned to act with awareness, to anticipate natural cycles, and to respect the limits of daylight. In a sense, Romans lived in a form of temporal mindfulness. You felt the day, rather than watched it pass numerically. Yet as empire, trade, and administration grew, pressures for standardization intensified. Merchants trading across provinces faced a practical problem. A daylight hour in Rome differed from a daylight hour in Alexandria. Coordinating contracts, deliveries, and payments required negotiation and compromise. Without fixed hours, disputes were frequent. Religious life further complicated matters. Festivals and sacrifices were tied to celestial phenomena, often requiring precise timing relative to sunrise or specific star risings. Priests and temple attendants became experts in observation. Even small errors could carry social or religious consequences. Time, though still flexible, was demanding attention. It carried moral and spiritual weight. You might imagine yourself as a Roman citizen, adjusting your life constantly to the sun. The day expands, contracts shifts with clouds, seasons, and latitude. Tasks are never uniform. Effort must be measured in relation to nature. Social, religious, and political obligations require constant awareness. You become attuned not just to the passage of hours, but to the world itself, the temperature, the light, the behavior of animals and people. This interaction shapes cognition and perception. Humans learn patterns, internalize them, and act preemptively. You are disciplined not by a clock, but by observation, memory, and adaptation. Flexibility becomes a survival skill. Precision exists only as a relative concept, framed by experience rather than measurement. Yet the tension between natural and standardized time loomed. Romans were preparing without fully realizing it for the eventual imposition of mechanical clocks that would ignore light, season, and solar rhythm. They were learning that time could be measured, anticipated, and standardized. But they were also learning how much human life could bend to its demands. In this interplay between nature and measurement, you begin to see the paradox. The more you seek to control time, the more it demands compliance. The Romans lived within an elastic temporal framework, yet even within this flexibility, time disciplined, structured, and shaped daily existence. By the end of a day, you might pause to reflect. The sun has traveled its arc, shadows have shifted, and hours have passed unevenly. You are tired, fulfilled, perhaps frustrated. Your life, like that of all Romans, is entwined with the rhythm of the natural world. And yet, You sense a future in which this rhythm may be overridden by machines, gears, and standardized hours, time no longer expanding and contracting with the day, but insisting on rigid obedience. The lingering question remains: what happens when humans succeed in capturing and standardizing time completely? Can life still bend to natural rhythms, or are we destined to live inside a structure that measures us as much as we measure it? Story 4. The Islamic Golden Age and the Mathematics of Prayer Time. If you lived in a city of the Islamic world during the 8th to 13th centuries, your life would revolve around daily prayers, and your sense of time would be both spiritual and practical. Unlike in medieval Europe or Rome, the precise timing of religious duties demanded careful observation of the sky, the sun, and sometimes the stars. Time was not an abstract sequence of numbers. It was woven into the cosmos, into your body, and into the rhythm of society. You wake before dawn, guided by a faint pre-dawn glow. This is the time for Fajr, the first of the 5 daily prayers. You do not consult a mechanical clock. Instead, you know the hour by observing the first light streaking across the horizon, the faint color of the sky, the position of nearby stars. For centuries, Muslim scholars and ordinary people alike mastered these natural signs. They became instruments of both devotion and daily organization. After the morning prayer, life continues according to daylight. Markets open, artisans begin their work, students attend schools, and farmers tend fields. But always your day is punctuated by prayer. Each prayer, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, and Isha, requires careful timing. The sun itself dictates the moment. The height of the sun, the length of shadows, the disappearance of light from the horizon. You must observe, calculate, or remember, because deviation is not only socially inconvenient, it is spiritually significant. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba, the need for precision gave rise to remarkable ingenuity. Scholars developed instruments like the astrolabe, a complex device capable of measuring the altitude of the sun and stars. With an astrolabe, you could determine prayer times with astonishing accuracy, even in distant lands or unfamiliar seasons. You did not just observe, you measured. Mathematics became a tool to interpret natural cycles. The Islamic Golden Age was, in part, a response to this need. Astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers collaborated to create precise methods for calculating time. They recorded the sun's movement throughout the year, developed tables for shadow lengths, and designed instruments to translate celestial motion into usable daily schedules. The practice of science and religion intertwined, because the consequences of imprecision were deeply human: missed prayers, disrupted trade, or social embarrassment. For ordinary citizens, this meant that life was a constant negotiation with time. You carried knowledge, whether consciously or intuitively, about when shadows reach certain lengths or when specific stars appear at night. Merchants timed their market attendance to coincide with prayer breaks, while travelers planned journeys to avoid being caught away from towns during forbidden hours. Even children learned to recognize sky patterns as guides for daily behavior. Mosques amplified the measurement of time. The muezzin, the person appointed to call the faithful to prayer, was not merely a voice but a living clock. You would listen for the call from a nearby minaret, aligning your actions to its timing. In larger cities, multiple minarets could create a chorus of coordination, ensuring that entire communities operated in sync with spiritual and civic schedules. Yet timekeeping was not uniform across the Islamic world. Latitude, season, and local topography influenced the observed hours. Scholars devised sophisticated methods to calculate exact times for prayers wherever you were, even in distant provinces. Mathematics was no longer abstract, it was a practical necessity, translating cosmic motion into human schedules. The impact on daily life was profound. You internalized a sense of measured time, blending observation, calculation, and social coordination. Life was disciplined, yet intimately connected to nature. Unlike mechanical clocks, which enforce uniformity regardless of context, this system required constant attention, awareness, and understanding of natural variation. In addition to religious purposes, precise timekeeping influenced other aspects of society. Legal systems relied on it to determine deadlines for contracts. Market operations were timed to avoid interference with prayer, and travelers calculated journeys to coincide with safe rest periods. Knowledge of the sun and stars became both spiritual and practical capital, shaping reputation, efficiency, and social trust. Even night was structured. Certain prayers or recitations occur after sunset, guided by the disappearance of light or the appearance of specific stars. Scholars devised tables and instruments to predict these intervals. You did not rely on guesswork. You relied on human ingenuity applied to celestial observation. And yet, for all this precision, time remained fundamentally tied to nature. Hours shifted with the season, and your daily rhythm still flowed with the sun. The Islamic world balanced standardization and flexibility, measurement and observation, human need and cosmic order. But the broader question loomed. As humans learned to measure, calculate, and predict time, how would their sense of life, work, and spiritual obligation change? What happens when society transitions from living with natural rhythms to living by instruments that enforce time with mechanical consistency? The answer would unfold slowly over centuries, but the seeds were already planted in these observant, mathematically attuned communities, where every shadow, every star, and every call to prayer shaped the invisible but inexorable architecture of daily life. By the 9th century, the Islamic world stretched across thousands of miles from the Iberian Peninsula to the Indus Valley. Trade, scholarship, and administration spanned regions with radically different daylight hours. This posed a profound challenge. How do you maintain the spiritual and social rhythm of daily prayers when the sun rises and sets at different times across the empire? The answer, unsurprisingly, was mathematics. Scholars, or ulama, and astronomers worked tirelessly to translate the movement of the heavens into a practical schedule for human life. They developed zijs, tables containing calculations for sunrise, sunset, and prayer times for specific latitudes and days of the year. Using these, a traveler in Baghdad could know when to pray in Cordoba, and vice versa, with remarkable accuracy. This was not trivial. Consider the Asr prayer, which depends on the length of a shadow relative to the object casting it. In one city, the shadow might be exactly twice your height, in another, slightly shorter or longer. Without calculation, you could err, unintentionally neglecting an obligation. Scholars thus created algorithms for shadow length, adjusted for latitude, season, and even local topography. Calculating the exact moment of Asr or Maghrib became a highly technical pursuit, blending geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic. The instruments of the time reflected this complexity. The astrolabe, perhaps the most famous, was a multifunctional device capable of telling time, finding prayer directions, and calculating celestial positions. Using it required training, careful observation, and mathematical skill. Simple observation of the sun's altitude or the shadows it cast was no longer sufficient in a world that demanded both spiritual precision and administrative coordination. Even in smaller towns, innovation followed necessity. Water clocks, sometimes combined with intricate mechanical devices, marked intervals of time for mosques. These clocks could trigger automatic calls to prayer, releasing small doors to reveal figures or sounds at the appointed hours. In larger cities like Baghdad and Cairo, public water clocks displayed time for the whole community. By the 11th century, some sophisticated devices used gears and floats to track hours, blending observation and mechanism, an early prelude to the European mechanical clock. Life in such cities revolved around this evolving system. You woke for Fajr guided by natural light or by a precise calculation. Work and commerce paused for Dhuhr and Asr, even if you were far from the mosque. Meals, rest, study, and travel were all coordinated around these temporal markers. Even children learned the rhythm of time through observation and participation in communal practices. Trade illustrates the practical importance of precise time. Merchants traveling from Cairo to Samarkand needed to plan journeys and market participation around prayer times, but also to coordinate with partners in distant cities. Missed timing could mean lost contracts or social friction. Measurement became a survival skill. Education reinforced these habits. Scholars taught geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy not only as abstract knowledge, but as applied science to regulate daily life. Students learned to compute prayer times, determine directions to Mecca, and predict sunrise and sunset. Timekeeping became both a civic and religious responsibility. Knowledge was power, because precise timing facilitated obedience, efficiency, and social cohesion. And yet, despite the sophistication, the system maintained flexibility. Unlike modern mechanical clocks, which demand universal conformity, the medieval Islamic world balanced human observation with calculated approximation. Prayer time tables accounted for variation, but individuals were expected to understand natural cues as well. Your daily life required attention, adaptability, and mindfulness. Time was exact, but also lived. This balance had broader consequences. By enforcing attention to solar movement, shadow lengths, and star positions, society cultivated spatial and temporal literacy. People internalized concepts of measurement and astronomy long before mechanical clocks arrived in Europe. Daily life became an education in celestial mathematics. Even tradespeople developed intuition for timing and rhythm. Yet the very act of measuring time across regions sowed the seeds of a new relationship with it. Time was no longer purely local, observed only through immediate sunlight and shadows. It became a shared abstraction, something that could be calculated, communicated, and standardized across great distances. Humanity was learning that the cosmos could be translated into human schedules, a revolutionary shift that would echo centuries later. At night, too, the stars provided guidance. Lunar and stellar observation allowed scholars to adjust prayer schedules in high-latitude regions or during overcast periods. You might rely on a combination of instruments and intuition. Life was disciplined, but not rigidly constrained. Precision coexisted with judgment. In this era, time demanded both intellect and attentiveness. You had to watch, calculate, and obey. Failure was not only practical, it was moral. Missed prayers or misalignment with the community's schedule could carry social consequences, or even accusations of negligence in religious duties. And yet, for all its precision, the system remained human. Instruments failed. Shadows were misread. Water clocks were miscalibrated. Scholars debated interpretations of astronomical tables. Time was exacting, but also negotiable. Human skill and observation remained essential. This delicate dance between observation, calculation, and social coordination prefigured the challenges European societies would face centuries later with mechanical clocks. It also illustrates a broader truth. Humans can bend nature to measurement, but only by cultivating awareness, discipline, and expertise. The lingering question arises naturally. Once time can be measured and enforced precisely, independent of the sun, stars, or human observation, what becomes of daily life, of human intuition, and of the natural rhythms that have guided survival for millennia? By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Islamic world had achieved something remarkable: the translation of natural time into calculable, shareable, and enforceable schedules. Life was no longer dictated solely by observation of the sun or stars. The combination of mathematics, instruments, and community expectation created a framework in which time could be known, predicted, and transmitted across vast distances. If you were a scholar in Baghdad, you might spend your morning calculating the exact moment of Asr prayer for a distant town in Persia. A merchant in Cairo would adjust his trading schedule according to these calculations. A traveler moving from the Arabian desert to North Africa would carry tables or instruments, relying on them to maintain spiritual and civic order. Time had become portable. It could be communicated. It could be obeyed. Yet despite this sophistication, life retained a human dimension. Instruments could fail, tables could be misread, clouds could obscure the sun. You still needed judgment, awareness, and attentiveness. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Practice mattered. You were constantly negotiating between human precision and the unpredictability of nature. Public life reflected this integration of observation and calculation. Mosques called the faithful to prayer according to calculated times, often verified by trained observers. Markets and workshops adjusted their schedules to align with the calls, and citizens internalized these rhythms. Even festivals, which required coordination over days, relied on accurate timekeeping. Life had become a dance between cosmic cycles and human calculation. The intellectual culture of the Islamic Golden Age emphasized that this knowledge was a moral and civic duty. Measuring time precisely was not only practical, it was ethical. Missing a prayer or failing to coordinate activity could disrupt social harmony. Knowledge of the heavens became intertwined with responsibility to the community. Interestingly, this system encouraged innovation in both science and daily life. Astronomers refined methods for predicting sunrise and sunset, engineers improved water clocks, and mathematicians developed algorithms for shadow lengths. Urban planners designed minarets and public spaces to optimize visibility and audibility of time signals. Citizens learned to anticipate and respond to time without needing mechanical enforcement. Awareness became a civic skill. Despite all these advancements, the underlying tension remained. Humans still lived within natural rhythms. The sun still rose and set. Seasons still changed day length dramatically. Instruments and calculations offered approximation and coordination, but they could not abolish the fact that daylight governed human activity. This tension is instructive. Time was simultaneously externalized and internalized. You learned to obey it, measure it, and calculate it, yet you could never escape its natural context. Your body still responded to light, fatigue, and hunger. Social and religious obligations imposed structure, but survival and habit maintained connection to the environment. For ordinary citizens, the implications were subtle but profound. You began to experience time as both fixed and fluid. Prayer schedules required obedience, but daylight and shadows still demanded adaptability. Merchants planned around calculations, but storms or cloud cover could alter schedules. Life became a constant negotiation between human precision and environmental variability. In broader terms, this period demonstrates a shift in the human relationship with time. Time was no longer purely observed or felt. It could be recorded, calculated, transmitted, and predicted. Knowledge itself became a tool for regulating society, shaping behavior, and coordinating activity across vast distances. Time became not just a measurement, but a shared obligation. Yet this new system carried risks. As humans learned to obey instruments and calculations, natural intuition and flexibility became less central. Dependence on measured schedules could erode adaptability, leaving communities vulnerable to unexpected changes, cloudy days, sudden travel delays, or disrupted instruments. By the end of the day, you might pause to reflect. The sun has set, the stars have risen, and prayers have been observed. Time, once a fluid, relational phenomenon experienced through observation and bodily awareness, has become something humans actively measure, transmit, and obey. Yet it remains rooted in nature, still bending life subtly in ways instruments cannot fully control. The Islamic Golden Age thus represents a critical moment in history. The first large-scale attempt to reconcile natural, observable time with human measurement and societal coordination. It shows that humans can extend the reach of temporal knowledge, yet they cannot fully escape the rhythms of the natural world. The question that echoes forward is unmistakable. When time becomes fully externalized, enforced by mechanical clocks, standardized across regions, and independent of observation, what becomes of human intuition, adaptability, and the sense of life flowing with the natural world. The experiments of the Islamic world offer a glimpse of the possibilities and limits, teaching that even in a society ruled by calculation, humans remain in dialogue with the sun, the stars, and the passage of the day. Story 5. Monastic Hours and the Discipline of Silence in Medieval Europe. If you entered a monastery in medieval Europe, you would quickly realize that the rhythm of life was not determined by sunrise or sunset alone, but by a complex sequence of prayer, work, and contemplation. Here, time was structured into canonical hours, a system designed to order the day and the soul with precise regularity. You would live in a world where every action, from eating to reading to tending the garden, was synchronized with the schedule of the bell. The first signal of the day arrived in darkness. Matins, or the night office, often began around midnight or in the early hours before dawn. You would rise from your simple cot, pull on a rough habit, and move quietly through the cloister to the church. The air was cold, your body heavy with sleep, yet the rhythm of prayer demanded obedience. The bell had already rung. Silence reigned, broken only by whispered responses and the soft shuffle of feet along stone floors. After matins came lauds at dawn. This was the first communal acknowledgement of daylight, a transition from night's introspection to daytime activity. You would chant psalms with your fellow monks, aligning your voice with the bell and the schedule. Even in the absence of mechanical clocks, the bell and your collective experience dictated time. It demanded punctuality, awareness, and attentiveness. Breakfast followed lauds, but only after the bell authorized it. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, and occasionally fruit or porridge. Silence was maintained during eating, broken only by the reading of scripture or other spiritual texts. You did not eat when hungry, but when the rhythm of the monastery allowed. Hunger and desire became subordinate to the schedule, teaching patience, discipline, and the prioritization of communal life over individual instinct. Mid-morning brought prime, the first hour of the day in canonical counting. Work began: tending gardens, copying manuscripts, preparing the scriptorium, or repairing buildings. Each task was bounded by the rhythm of prayer. Terce marked mid-morning, sext midday, and none mid-afternoon. The schedule was relentless. Your life was segmented into spiritual and practical intervals. Even labor, normally tied to physical exertion or daylight, now adhered to the clocking of the soul. Silence was enforced, not merely out of tradition, but as a tool to heighten awareness of time and duty. Every sound, from the tolling of the bell to the scratching of a quill, carried weight. Monks learned to internalize the passage of hours, their bodies and minds becoming attuned to the flow of ritual and labor. Time was no longer just observed, it was embodied. The Vespers in the late afternoon marked the transition from labor back to reflection. You would gather for communal prayer, once again aligning your body and mind to the rhythm dictated by the bell. Afterward came Compline, the final office of the day, observed before sleep. The day concluded not with personal choice but with a collective act of discipline, a closing of the spiritual arc that mirrored the natural arc of daylight, though sometimes extending beyond it. Even outside the cloister walls, the influence of monastic hours extended into society. Towns and villages depended on nearby monasteries to signal canonical hours, especially in regions lacking other public timekeeping devices. Bells tolled across fields, markets, and roads, structuring the life of the wider community. For laypeople, the monastery was both a spiritual guide and a temporal authority. Daily life in the monastery cultivated both resilience and awareness. You became sensitive to every cue: the toll of the bell, the faint light of dawn, the lengthening of shadows in the scriptorium. Your body learned to function with segmented sleep. Your mind adapted to alternating cycles of labor and prayer. By participating in this disciplined life, you internalized a sophisticated understanding of time, one that was both practical and spiritual. Work was not just physical effort, it was a meditation. Copying manuscripts, gardening, or repairing stonework became exercises in temporal awareness. You counted hours not in minutes but in sequences of prayer, observing how much could be accomplished within a given canonical period. Time became simultaneously external, measured by bells and ritual, and internal, lived through habit, attention, and reflection. The discipline of silence amplified this temporal consciousness. With limited conversation, the mind focused on tasks, prayer, and observation. Every movement had purpose. You began to sense the invisible architecture of the day, the unbroken rhythm connecting night, dawn, labor, and reflection. Time was present not just in clocks or bells, but in the very structure of life. Yet despite this meticulous organization, there was tension. The human body still demanded flexibility. Fatigue, illness, or seasonal changes disrupted even the most disciplined routines. Monks had to negotiate between obedience to the schedule and the realities of human limitation. The system demanded both adaptation and surrender, teaching a constant awareness of the balance between human will and structured time. And in this tension lies a question that would reverberate beyond the monastery walls. As human life becomes increasingly regimented by external signals, bells, prayers, calculations, what is lost in our perception of natural time, personal rhythm, and intuitive understanding of day and night? How does strict obedience shape the human experience of life itself? By mid-morning, the monastery had settled into its rhythm. You, as a monk, had already participated in 2 offices, matins and lauds, and observed the first meal of the day. Now, the hours of labor stretched ahead, punctuated by prime, terce, sext, and none. Each bell carried a weight far beyond signaling. It structured your perception of time, your productivity, and even your inner consciousness. The physical demands were subtle but constant. Gardening, tending livestock, or hauling water required awareness not only of the task, but of its placement within the day. How much could be completed before the next office? Could you pace yourself to avoid exhaustion yet remain diligent? The canonical hours transformed ordinary labor into a measured exercise, an interplay of body, mind, and temporal discipline. In the scriptorium, the task was different but equally demanding. Copying manuscripts required extraordinary focus, patience, and steadiness. The bell dictated the boundaries. How many lines could you safely transcribe before terce? Would you be able to maintain clarity of thought and hand before sext? Every sound, every interruption, became an intrusion upon the rhythm of life you had internalized. Time became both a tool and a master, shaping even the most subtle aspects of daily existence. Silence amplified your sensitivity. Without constant conversation, every auditory cue became meaningful. The toll of a bell, the rustle of robes, or the creak of a door could shift your awareness instantly. Monks learned to move with precision, speaking only when necessary, and to interpret subtle changes in sound as signs of time passing or tasks beginning and ending. This heightened sensory perception was essential to living fully within the monastery's temporal framework. Yet the human mind often tested the system. Fatigue, boredom, and monotony challenged focus. The repetition of offices and labor could dull attention, even as the bells demanded obedience. Monks relied on techniques to remain vigilant: meditation, mindfulness of breath, and deliberate attention to bodily movements. In this way, the monastery became an early laboratory of psychological discipline, where external time and internal awareness intersected. Meals, too, were carefully measured. They were eaten in silence, their timing prescribed by bells and ritual. Hunger was subordinated to schedule. The body learned to anticipate the next office, adjusting metabolism and energy reserves to the unseen clock of canonical hours. In effect, the monastery trained both body and mind to function in harmony with imposed rhythm, cultivating endurance, attention, and adaptability. Even leisure and rest followed this pattern. Sleep was segmented, punctuated by nocturnal offices like matins or vigils. Extended rest was often impossible. Your body adjusted to periods of activity and wakefulness dictated by external signals. Over time, you internalized this rhythm. Waking before dawn became effortless, labor and prayer flowed naturally, and your sense of time became inseparable from the monastery itself. This discipline extended to moral and spiritual life. The schedule instilled a sense of accountability. Missing an office, arriving late, or failing to maintain attention during labor was not merely a practical failure but a moral lapse. The monastery's temporal system trained obedience, humility, and mindfulness. You learned to perceive time as a framework for spiritual cultivation as well as physical and social order. Yet challenges persisted. Seasonal changes disrupted natural light, requiring adjustments in task packing or reading in dim conditions. Illness or injury could prevent participation in offices or labor, forcing monks to reconcile obedience with bodily limitation. The canonical hours demanded both flexibility and submission, teaching lessons in patience, resilience, and the negotiation of human limitation. The broader community felt the monastery's temporal discipline, too. Bells echoed beyond cloister walls, influencing townspeople who relied on monastic signals to structure work, worship, and social activity. The monastery became both a spiritual guide and a temporal authority, shaping rhythms far beyond its walls. You were part of a network in which individual action aligned with communal coordination, all orchestrated through measured sound and ritual. Even within the rigid structure, human creativity found room. Monks composed chants and hymns, designed gardens and crafted manuscripts, all within the temporal constraints of the day. Time, though regimented, was also a canvas. Obedience to schedule did not eliminate invention, it shaped it. Precision encouraged reflection, measurement, and deliberate action. Life became a careful negotiation between freedom and structure, spontaneity and routine. And yet, as strict as the monastic schedule was, it raised a profound question. What happens when humans learn to live entirely according to externalized time, rather than internal cues or natural rhythms? The monastery demanded obedience to bells, prayers, and offices, subordinating natural instincts to structured cycles. How much autonomy could survive under such relentless scheduling, and what would happen when secular society later adopted similar regimentation through mechanical clocks? The monastic system, with its combination of bells, silence, and labor, became both a training ground and a mirror. It demonstrated that human life could be measured, coordinated, and disciplined without mechanical instruments, but also that such measurement reshaped perception, behavior, and even spiritual experience. As the day drew to Vespers and Compline, you might pause to reflect on the journey from dawn to night. Hours lived, prayers recited, labor completed, and attention sustained. The rhythm of the monastery had guided your body and mind through every moment, leaving you both enriched and subtly transformed. Life inside these walls demonstrated the power of temporal discipline and the cost of surrendering personal flexibility to an external schedule. And yet, even as you slept through the night, awaiting matins once more, a question lingered. If obedience to time could shape body, mind, and spirit so profoundly within the monastery, what would happen when the same principles extended into secular life, enforced by mechanical clocks and societal expectation? Could humans retain their natural intuition, or would life itself begin to bend to measured hours? As night fell over the monastery, the last echoes of Compline faded, leaving silence in its wake. Yet even in this stillness, the architecture of time exerted influence. Sleep was never fully free. Matins awaited in the early hours, a reminder that life was organized around a cycle far larger than individual desire. Bells, chants, and rituals were the instruments of discipline, shaping existence minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. By the 13th century, monasteries across Europe had perfected this temporal framework. Bells rang with precise intervals, guiding work, prayer, and rest. Monks internalized these rhythms to the point that even absent the bells, their bodies and minds maintained a natural alignment with canonical hours. Time was both external and internalized. It governed their lives through sound, ritual, and habit, yet lived within them as instinct, shaping perception, expectation, and action. The system was remarkably effective. Work became reliable, communal prayer remained synchronized, and the monastery functioned as a cohesive organism. Labor, learning, and devotion were no longer separate activities, they were harmonized within the daily cycle. Even the human body adapted. Segmented sleep, regulated meals, and repetitive activity fostered endurance, attention, and resilience. Silence reinforced this effect. By removing distractions, it heightened awareness of temporal signals. A single bell could mobilize the entire community, and absence of the bell could create unease. Monks became experts in listening not only to sound, but to the subtle cues of passing time. Movement, shadow, and light were all measured against the rhythm of prayer and labor. You learned to read life itself through the architecture of time. This disciplined life carried broader societal implications. Surrounding communities, even those outside the cloister, relied on monastic signals. Bells tolled across towns and villages, structuring civic life, market hours, and communal labor. The monastery became a temporal authority, shaping the wider environment with its carefully maintained schedule. You could live miles away and still feel the monastery's governance of time, a constant reminder that human life had become inseparable from structured hours. Yet there were challenges. The system demanded obedience, but humans are not machines. Fatigue, illness, and seasonal changes required adaptation. The rigidity of canonical hours had to accommodate natural variability. Monks negotiated these tensions daily, balancing submission to schedule with recognition of bodily and environmental needs. Through this, they internalized both discipline and flexibility, a paradox at the heart of monastic life. Perhaps most striking was the psychological transformation. The relentless sequence of prayer and labor trained attention, patience, and awareness of passing moments. Monks became attuned to time not as a concept, but as a lived experience. They observed, anticipated, and responded to temporal structure in ways that secular populations would only experience centuries later with mechanical clocks. Indeed, monasteries acted as incubators for the cultural understanding of structured time. The disciplined obedience cultivated here would eventually extend into towns, guilds, universities, and courts. When mechanical clocks began to appear in Europe during the 14th century, society was already primed to accept strict schedules. The monastery had trained people to live by external measures, internalizing rhythm, compliance, and the subtle authority of timed signals. And yet, even in this regimented world, human creativity and adaptation persisted. Monks composed, copied, and illustrated manuscripts, cultivated gardens, and maintained libraries, all within strict temporal constraints. Life, though measured and disciplined, was still rich. Structure did not eliminate meaning, it amplified it, shaping not just what was done, but how it was experienced. Time became both a tool and a medium, shaping thought, action, and spiritual life. Looking back, the monastery offers a remarkable insight. Structured time teaches obedience, coordination, and mindfulness, but also reshapes perception. It molds humans to respond to external signals, align behavior with collective rhythms, and internalize discipline. Yet it also raises questions about autonomy, intuition, and the relationship between human life and natural cycles. As the last bell of the day fades and silence fills the cloister, one cannot help but wonder, when the same principles of temporal discipline move beyond monasteries into secular life, governing factories, schools, and offices, what will become of the human experience? Will intuition and natural rhythms survive, or will life bend entirely to the ticking of an external clock? The monastery thus stands as both a historical practice and a philosophical experiment, a society built around time as a moral and practical framework. It teaches that obedience, attention, and rhythm can be cultivated, yet it also reminds us of the cost, the subtle surrender of autonomy, the reshaping of perception, and the intimate bond between human life and the architecture of hours. Story 6. The rise of mechanical clocks in medieval cities. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, European towns were changing. Markets were growing, trade was expanding, and communities required more precise coordination than monasteries or natural cues could provide. The solution emerged in a marvel of human ingenuity: mechanical clocks. These were not the small, pocket-sized devices we know today, but large, complex machines, often housed in church towers or city halls, striking the hours with metal bells that could be heard across cobbled streets. Imagine standing in the town square of medieval Paris or Milan. A massive clock looms above, its gears hidden behind stone walls. Inside, escapements, weights, and wheels turn with precision, releasing a hammer that strikes a bell. The sound carries far, declaring to everyone, the hour has come. Whether you are a merchant arranging goods in the marketplace, a craftsman finishing a task, or a citizen simply walking by, you must respond. Time, for the first time in many communities, speaks independently of human observation or natural phenomena. Before mechanical clocks, towns relied on sundials, bells from monasteries, and informal observation. These methods were adequate for rural life or small towns, but expanding commerce and civic administration demanded consistency. A guild meeting, a tax collection, or a legal proceeding could no longer hinge solely on the judgment of local officials or the sun's position. The mechanical clock introduced regularity and accountability. Construction of these clocks was labor-intensive and technologically ambitious. Blacksmiths forged iron gears, carpenters assembled wooden frames, and clockmakers calibrated complex mechanisms that could weigh thousands of pounds. Many early clocks did not even have faces. They existed primarily to strike bells at regular intervals. Time was first communicated audibly, then visually. The bell became both authority and signal, extending the lessons learned in monasteries to the secular world. Urban populations responded in a mix of awe and apprehension. For ordinary citizens, the sound of the bell was a new kind of command. Where once the tolling of a monastery bell suggested routine and spiritual guidance, the mechanical bell demanded obedience to the city itself. Work, trade, and social life were now framed not just by daylight, but by a manufactured, uniform rhythm. Time had become an external force that measured human behavior independently of nature or tradition. These clocks also altered social hierarchy. Wealthy towns and influential guilds often financed the construction and maintenance of clocks, turning them into symbols of civic pride. A prominent tower clock demonstrated power, sophistication, and mastery over both technology and time. Citizens, on the other hand, were disciplined by these instruments, required to conform to hours that were no longer elastic. The human body, accustomed to variable daylight or monastic rhythm, had to adjust to mechanical regularity. Maintenance of the clocks was a constant challenge. Friction, weather, and wear threatened precision. Clockmakers became highly specialized professionals, traveling between towns to repair and calibrate machines. The pursuit of accuracy spurred innovations in metallurgy, gear design, and timekeeping theory. Even small improvements had outsized effects. A more reliable clock meant more coordinated markets, courts, and civic life. Daily life began to adapt around the mechanical hours. Guilds synchronized work shifts with the striking of bells. Merchants timed deliveries to coincide with hour signals. City officials scheduled meetings, toll collections, and public announcements according to the new, standardized rhythm. Even leisure followed suit. Fairs, tournaments, and festivals were organized by the hour rather than by sun or seasonal approximation. The mechanical clock also influenced perception. Time, once a flexible, observed phenomenon, became measurable, uniform, and inescapable. You could no longer rely on intuition or local cues. Obedience required attention to a consistent, external signal. Early cities witnessed a subtle shift. Humans were increasingly disciplined by time itself, rather than by custom or nature. Yet mechanical clocks had limitations. They were expensive, visible only to those near the tower, and imprecise by modern standards. Minutes were not yet counted. Hours themselves were often unequal, adjusted seasonally in some cases. Still, their impact was transformative. Towns learned to coordinate large populations, anticipate events, and enforce schedules with authority that transcended individual judgment. The spread of mechanical clocks across Europe set the stage for a radical social shift. Where monasteries had taught obedience to bells and natural rhythm, towns taught obedience to gears and hammers. Time was no longer mediated by observation alone. It became a civic instrument, shaping work, trade, and social interaction. Humans learned, consciously or not, to respond to an externalized temporal authority that was precise, public, and unrelenting. As the day wore on and bells struck hour after hour, townsfolk internalized a new kind of discipline. The human body, once attuned to sunlight or monastic rhythm, began to synchronize with the mechanical beat of the city. Work, meals, and even sleep were gradually influenced by this artificial but powerful schedule. Society was learning to live within a framework that extended beyond the natural cycles of day and night. And yet, a tension lingered. Humans were now adapting to a system they did not control. The bell tolled not for spiritual reflection, not for local convenience, but because gears dictated it. The individual became subordinate to time itself, measured and announced by machines. This raises a question that resonates across centuries. Once humans surrender the measurement of their lives to mechanisms, how much control remains over the experience of living? As mechanical clocks became more common in European cities during the 14th century, their influence extended far beyond the town square. The striking of the hour was no longer simply a signal. It became a regulator of human life, transforming work, commerce, governance, and even social expectations. For the first time, large populations were coordinated according to an external standard that was independent of sun, stars, or human perception. If you were a merchant in Florence, you would rise not only with daylight but in anticipation of the hour struck by the city clock. The bell determined when the market opened, when workshops paused for meals, and when guild meetings began. Craftsmen timed production to the strike, ensuring that orders could be delivered on schedule. Travelers adjusted their journeys to coincide with audible signals from nearby clock towers. Mechanical time had begun to shape both perception and action, binding individuals into a collective rhythm that transcended personal habit. The clocks themselves were marvels of ingenuity. Early tower clocks relied on large iron gears, weights, and virgin foliate escapements. They required constant maintenance, the grind of metal against metal, lubrication of moving parts, and careful adjustment of weights to maintain consistent motion. Towns employed skilled clockkeepers who not only wound the mechanisms, but also ensured the correct timekeeping relative to sunrise, seasons, or local custom. Their labor, often invisible to the majority of citizens, became crucial to the functioning of urban life. The striking of the bell carried authority. It dictated not only work schedules but also moral and social behavior. In towns without monasteries nearby, citizens relied on the city clock to mark prayer times, public meetings, or curfews. Noise ordinances, market regulations, and civic duties were enforced through the predictability of mechanical hours. Obedience was no longer a moral suggestion, but a social expectation. Time had been externalized into a system that demanded recognition and conformity. Even leisure became structured. Public festivals, tournaments, and civic ceremonies were scheduled according to clock hours rather than natural observation. Meals, previously aligned with daylight, increasingly followed artificial temporal markers. The clock's influence extended into the domestic sphere. Household routines, servant labor, and social visits were all subject to the standardized rhythm established by the bell. Human life was bending to gears and weights, a subtle but profound transformation. Guilds and trades exemplified the impact of mechanical clocks. Workshops coordinated production shifts to match the striking of the hour. Master craftsmen timed apprentices, work, breaks, and instruction around bell signals. Market regulations when merchants could sell, when taxes were collected, when fairs became enforceable because time itself was standardized and observable. The very organization of labor shifted from personal judgment to mechanical accountability. Even civic governance depended on these instruments. Town councils scheduled sessions based on the clock, not the subjective discretion of officials. Legal proceedings followed measured hours, and curfews were strictly enforced by the striking bell. Urban populations learned to anticipate the hour and to structure their activities accordingly. Time became both a shared resource and a regulatory force, extending beyond individual experience to societal coordination. The psychological impact was equally profound. Humans, once attuned to natural cycles of sun and shadow, or the measured rhythm of monastic bells, now responded to an artificial, uniform, and relentless signal. The bell imposed a uniformity that reduced variability in perception and action. Attention, memory, and habit began to align with mechanical time, conditioning individuals to anticipate, obey, and internalize the beat of the gears. Life itself became measured. Yet limitations persisted. Early clocks were inaccurate by modern standards, often varying by minutes or even hours per day. Towns relied on observation of the sun or reference to ecclesiastical signals to recalibrate. Despite imperfection, however, the principle was established. Time could be externalized, standardized, and enforced through machinery. Even an imprecise clock began to synchronize communities, coordinate work, and redefine human expectation. This shift also introduced subtle social hierarchies. Citizens who could interpret, anticipate, and respond effectively to mechanical time gained advantages in trade, work, and civic participation. Those less attentive peasants, itinerant laborers, or travelers risked being out of step with social norms. Mastery of mechanical time became a form of social literacy, reinforcing the power of cities and their governing structures. Finally, the rise of mechanical clocks hints at a deeper transformation in human consciousness. The perception of time shifted from relative observation to fixed measurement. Where once time was elastic, varying with daylight, seasons, or social context, it became uniform, continuous, and external. Humans were now measured by time itself rather than by natural cues. Daily life required obedience to signals beyond personal perception or intuition. And yet, even as towns synchronized activity to the clock, questions remained. How would humans adapt when mechanical time became more precise, more pervasive, and unyielding? Could society maintain flexibility and intuition, or would life bend entirely to the relentless cadence of gears and bells? The answers would unfold over the coming centuries, shaping work, social interaction, and human perception in ways unimaginable to the first citizens who heard a bell strike the hour from a distant tower. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, mechanical clocks had begun to redefine life in cities across Europe. Where monasteries had trained obedience to spiritual rhythms and towns had relied on bells, gears now dictated the daily tempo of civic existence. Time had become externalized, precise, and most importantly uniform. The human experience of the day was no longer elastic, tied to the sun or seasons, but standardized, imposed, and visible to all. Imagine yourself in a bustling urban square. The clock tower strikes, and the sound travels across streets, workshops, and markets. Merchants pause, apprentices adjust their labor, students leave lessons, and townspeople shift their activities in unison. The bell is both signal and authority. You cannot ignore it. It structures life independently of desire, light, or personal judgment. It is the first time many humans have experienced such an impersonal, public measure of existence. This uniformity brought advantages. Trade became more reliable. Goods could be transported according to standardized intervals. Legal proceedings, market operations, and guild activities could be scheduled with precision. The social fabric of the city relied on shared awareness of the hour. Even leisure and religious practice were coordinated. Fairs opened on the hour, prayers were adjusted to bell strikes, and public assemblies adhered to the clock's cadence. Mechanical time became the connective tissue of civic life. Yet the imposition of time also demanded adaptation. Your body and habits, once attuned to natural light or monastic rhythm, now had to adjust to the relentless strike of gears. Lunch and dinner were no longer determined by hunger or sun position, but by hourly bells. Labor, rest, and prayer were increasingly subordinated to an external measure. Humans were learning, often unconsciously, to live within a temporal framework that was artificial, uniform, and unyielding. The clocks themselves were extraordinary technical achievements. Early tower clocks used virgin foliate escapements, large iron wheels, and heavy weights. These mechanisms required regular maintenance and precise calibration. Skilled clockkeepers became essential personnel, ensuring that the time displayed remained accurate relative to sunlight, ceremonial practice, or municipal regulation. Without them, the system could falter, revealing the fragility underlying what appeared to be perfect order. The social consequences were profound. Punctuality became a civic virtue. Being late was no longer merely an inconvenience. It suggested negligence, incompetence, or disrespect for communal standards. The rise of mechanical clocks nurtured a new cultural awareness that time could be measured independently, that society demanded adherence to objective hours, and that human behavior could be regulated through uniform temporal standards. This standardization also reinforced hierarchy and power. Municipal authorities and guilds wielded temporal control, directing labor and commerce through the city clock. Citizens had to synchronize with schedules they did not control, embedding obedience into the very structure of daily life. The bell became a subtle enforcer of social order, reminding everyone that time was now both public property and a governing force. Yet adaptation was uneven. Rural populations, smaller towns, and travelers remained partially reliant on natural cues. The sun, seasons, and observation continued to influence daily life. Urban dwellers, however, were increasingly governed by mechanical hours. Life within the city became a negotiation with gears. Humans adjusted sleep, labor, prayer, and leisure to fit the rigid beat of the clock. In doing so, they were pioneers in a relationship with time that would define modern society. The psychological impact was equally notable. Uniform hours shaped perception, cognition, and expectation. Attention became segmented. Anticipation was keyed to the next bell. Planning extended beyond instinct to calculated timing. Humans were, for the first time, living in a world where time existed externally, demanding recognition and obedience, yet not mediated by the natural environment. Even culture adapted. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and civic rituals began to follow mechanical hours. Music, literature, and performance were scheduled with reference to clocks. The city itself became a temporal organism, integrating social, economic, and cultural life into a single, coordinated rhythm. Mechanical time had moved from novelty to necessity, structuring existence in ways invisible but undeniable. And yet, for all its influence, the mechanical clock could not entirely abolish human variability. Illness, fatigue, weather, and unforeseen events still disrupted schedules. Humans learned to negotiate both obedience to the bell and flexibility in practice. This tension between exact measurement and lived experience became a defining characteristic of modern life, anticipating challenges that would multiply with smaller, personal timepieces in later centuries. By the end of the day, as the last bell tolled, you might reflect on the profound transformation unfolding around you. Life had become measured, coordinated, and disciplined by a machine. The human experience of hours had shifted from natural and elastic to external and uniform. Obedience, awareness, and anticipation had been trained by gears and hammers. Society itself was learning to live within a rhythm dictated not by the sun, but by human invention. And yet, the most pressing question remained. As mechanical time became more precise, pervasive, and personal, how would humans adapt? Could natural intuition survive, or would life gradually bend entirely to the ticking of machines? The rise of mechanical clocks in medieval cities was only the beginning of a long experiment, one that would redefine work, social life, and human consciousness for centuries to come. Story 7. Time and the Industrial Revolution, the birth of the standard workday. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe had changed again, more radically than in centuries past. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, transforming rural landscapes into urban centers filled with factories, smoke, and the ceaseless hum of machinery. But amidst the innovation, one invisible force increasingly dominated life: time, now measured, standardized, and enforced with unprecedented precision. The factory bell would become the defining instrument of human daily existence. If you were a worker in Manchester or Birmingham, your life no longer followed the sun, the seasons, or even the communal rhythms of the monastery or city square. You were bound to a schedule determined by factory owners, dictated by the need for efficiency, profit, and uniform production. The bell announced the beginning of your shift, dictated breaks, and signaled the end of work. Obedience to its tone was not optional. Your body and mind were now regulated by artificial temporal authority, and the elasticity of previous centuries, where labor bent to daylight and circumstance, was gone. Factories required consistent, repeatable labor. Machines could not pause for fatigue or season. They demanded human operators attuned to mechanical rhythm. Unlike in pre-industrial towns, where time could be approximated by bells, sunlight, or social custom, industrial laborers had to synchronize precisely with clocks. Minutes became critical. Arriving late by even a quarter hour could mean dismissal. The clock replaced the sun, the seasons, and natural cycles as the arbiter of human productivity. The transition was profound. For generations, humans had lived with flexible schedules, measured by natural observation or communal signals. Even monastic discipline and city clocks had allowed some adaptability. The Industrial Revolution introduced rigid, uniform time as a prerequisite for economic survival. Human bodies, previously synchronized with sunlight, began to adjust to factory bells and mechanical rhythms. The result was both efficiency and strain. Schedules compressed, sleep was fragmented, and attention was continuously demanded. The standardization of time also reshaped social life. Markets, transportation, and schools increasingly adhered to industrial hours. Public transportation schedules were adjusted to align with factory shifts, creating a web of coordination spanning urban landscapes. Workers and families found themselves living in unison with machines and clocks rather than the natural environment. The modern workday, with its fixed hours, was born. Factories were not just sites of production, they were training grounds in time discipline. Supervisors monitored punctuality, often using pocket watches or factory-installed clocks to ensure compliance. Workers internalized a new temporal literacy, the ability to anticipate shifts, breaks, and deadlines with exactitude. The mastery of mechanical time became essential not only for survival, but for social acceptance. Yet for ordinary laborers, the human cost was significant. Fatigue, injury, and mental strain became commonplace as bodies adapted to the relentless beat of machines and the factory bell. The natural markers of time's sunrise, daylight, seasonal changes were subordinated to industrial necessity. Humans were becoming cogs in the machine, both literally and figuratively, their lives measured by uniform hours rather than the ebb and flow of natural life. The new temporal regime also demanded cultural adaptation. Leisure, previously structured by natural light or community customs, now had to be planned around factory hours. Social gatherings, meals, and even religious practices were increasingly constrained by the clock. Time became a resource to be allocated, rationed, and obeyed. The elasticity of human experience shrank as uniformity and precision expanded. Transportation innovations, particularly railways, amplified the need for standard time. Cities and regions connected by trains could not operate on local solar time. Schedules required synchronization. Factories, markets, and communication networks all relied on clocks that measured minutes with precision. The human perception of time began to shift. Punctuality, efficiency, and scheduling became moral as well as practical imperatives. The psychological impact was profound. Humans, once attuned to environmental cues and social rhythms, now experienced a new external authority, the uniform, relentless ticking of the industrial clock. Attention, anticipation, and obedience became daily skills. Life was segmented into fixed intervals, measured and enforced by instruments designed to maximize productivity. The elasticity that had governed pre-industrial life was gone. Compliance became survival. And yet, even amidst these pressures, humans adapted creatively. Communities reorganized around factory schedules. Families restructured daily routines. Cultural practices shifted to align with industrial time. But the fundamental lesson was clear. Once life is measured, coordinated, and enforced by mechanical time, human behavior and perception itself is profoundly reshaped. The Industrial Revolution marks a turning point in the human relationship with time. For the first time, the majority of people were disciplined by the clock on a daily, unrelenting basis. The rhythms of work, social life, and even sleep were now dictated by external, artificial schedules rather than natural observation or tradition. Time had become not just a measurement, but a tool of social control and human adaptation. The lingering question is unavoidable. As humans surrender more of their lives to precise schedules, what becomes of intuition, flexibility, and natural rhythm? When time is no longer experienced but enforced, how is human consciousness reshaped? The answers, which would unfold over the 19th and 20th centuries, would forever alter work, culture, and perception itself. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the rhythm of urban life became increasingly dictated by the factory bell, transforming both work and consciousness. Unlike previous eras, when time was measured by sunlight, monastic bells, or city clocks, the industrial schedule demanded continuous, precise, and enforced synchronization. The human body and mind were now instruments within a larger mechanical system. Consider a textile mill in Manchester around 1830. The workday often began at 6 a.m. before sunrise in winter months. Workers, many of them children, rose in darkness, leaving homes cramped with large families and poor ventilation. The factory bell signaled the start of labor, and the clatter of looms became the heartbeat of the day. There was no flexibility. A late arrival could mean dismissal or, for the youngest, punishment. Time, once elastic and socially negotiated, now pressed with mechanical insistence. Labor itself was regimented by precise intervals. Breaks were brief, dictated by the bell, and often too short to rest adequately. Meals had to be consumed quickly, synchronized with the overall flow of production. Sleep was truncated. Fatigue accumulated silently, yet workers had no authority over the packing of the day. For the first time, millions of people lived in daily subordination to an externalized temporal authority designed not for spiritual guidance, civic coordination, or natural alignment, but for industrial efficiency and profit. Factories became laboratories of discipline. Foremen wielded the clock as a tool of control. Workers learned to anticipate the sound of the bell, to internalize its rhythm, and to adjust bodily and mental effort accordingly. Human attention, once self-regulated, was now directed and measured externally. The ability to synchronize with time became a survival skill. Failure to do so was immediately consequential. This strict temporal regulation did more than shape labor, it reshaped social consciousness. Punctuality became a moral virtue. Efficiency was celebrated. Obedience to the clock was equated with reliability and trustworthiness. Communities, previously governed by seasonal work cycles or local custom, now conformed to a new rhythm that prioritized industrial needs over individual intuition or natural cycles. The workday became a collective experiment in behavioral conditioning. Transportation intensified this transformation. The expansion of railways required standardized time to avoid collisions and coordinate schedules. Previously, towns set local time according to the sun, so noon in one village could differ from noon just a few miles away. Standardized railway time created a uniform temporal framework across regions, extending the reach of mechanical discipline from factories to cities, towns, and countryside. Workers, merchants, and travelers all had to adjust to an externally enforced clock. The effect on perception was profound. Workers experienced time as segmented into strict intervals, with each minute carrying social and economic weight. Unlike pre-industrial labor, which could ebb and flow according to natural light or bodily capacity, industrial time demanded continuous, attentive participation. Humans were now living in minutes as much as hours, with every second potentially relevant to survival, pay, or social standing. Despite the rigidity, people adapted creatively. Laborers developed informal strategies for coping with fatigue, boredom, and monotony. Meal efficiency became a practiced skill. Informal games, conversations, and camaraderie filled the gaps between mechanical demands. Families adjusted routines to align with factory hours, teaching children the new rhythm from birth. Society internalized mechanical time so thoroughly that even leisure and social life became synchronized with work schedules. Yet the costs were undeniable. Chronic fatigue, stress, and injury increased. Natural bodily rhythms, sleep cycles, hunger, and seasonal cycles were subordinated to an artificial, unyielding schedule. Humans became dependent on external signals, and intuition about time gradually diminished. The factory bell replaced natural cues. The mind began to track time externally, and perception became linked to obedience rather than instinct. This transformation illustrates a fundamental shift in the human relationship with time, from flexible observation to strict compliance. Monastic bells taught discipline to a small population. Mechanical city clocks extended it to urban society. Industrial bells imposed it on millions. Time became an instrument of power, an organizing principle, and a condition of survival. Human behavior, attention, and social life were being reshaped, minute by minute, bell by bell. The Industrial Revolution thus represents not only a technological shift, but a profound psychological and cultural one. Life was now measured externally, efficiency was moralized, and obedience to the clock became an essential skill. Humans were no longer merely living in time, they were living for the clock. And yet a question remained unresolved. As laborers, families, and entire societies internalized this mechanical rhythm, what became of natural perception, intuition, and human flexibility? Could life retain its elasticity when every action, meal, and rest period was subordinated to the industrial schedule? The answer would unfold in the decades to come, with profound consequences for health, culture, and the structure of daily life. By the mid-19th century, the standard workday had become a fixture across industrial Europe. Time, once measured by sunlight, seasonal changes, or communal signals, was now uniform, external, and inescapable. The factory bell had transformed life, embedding mechanical rhythm into the very structure of society. Humans were no longer free to follow natural cues. They were disciplined by gears, hammers, and standardized schedules. If you were a textile worker in Manchester in 1850, your day was entirely framed by the industrial clock. The first bell called you from your modest dwelling before dawn. Work continued for 10, 12, or even 14 hours, punctuated by brief, regulated breaks. Meals were consumed quickly, sleep was segmented, and attention was demanded continuously. The city itself became a machine. Streets, markets, transportation, and labor all synchronized to the industrial schedule. The bell was omnipresent, a sound that regulated life more powerfully than sunlight or seasons ever had. The psychological and physical consequences were profound. Workers experienced chronic fatigue, stress, and sometimes permanent injury as their bodies adapted to repetitive labor under rigid schedules. Natural rhythms, circadian cycles, hunger, and personal energy were subordinated to artificial measures. Humans learned to live within an externally imposed time frame, internalizing the demands of the factory clock and the expectations of industrial society. Obedience became not only necessary for survival, but also a moral and social expectation. Yet this rigid schedule also created new forms of social coordination and efficiency. Factory owners could predict output, schedule deliveries, and maximize profit. Transportation systems, aligned with industrial time, allowed the rapid movement of goods and people. Communities, schools, and markets adjusted to mechanical schedules, and urban life became increasingly synchronized. Time was no longer personal or local. It had become public, standardized, and enforceable. This period also marks the beginning of what would later be called time discipline on a societal scale. Workers learned to anticipate bells, coordinate labor with coworkers, and organize daily routines around external signals. Punctuality became a moral virtue, efficiency a cultural expectation. Humans were being trained minute by minute to live in a world dominated by standardized temporal authority. Railways amplified this transformation. Trains required uniform schedules across vast distances, further divorcing daily life from natural light and local observation. Industrial time was now regional, sometimes national. Clocks in factories, stations, and town halls synchronized the lives of millions. A new consciousness emerged. Life was measured not only locally, but as part of a vast, interconnected temporal network. Humans were learning to obey, anticipate, and internalize time as an external authority. The rise of mechanical and industrial time also shaped broader culture. Leisure activities, religious practice, and social life were subordinated to the workday. Communities learned to plan gatherings, markets, and festivals according to schedules dictated by productivity. Even sleep, previously dictated by darkness or natural rhythms, became influenced by shift work and factory demands. Life was now a continuous negotiation between human needs and the mechanical imperatives of industrial society. This transformation represents a profound historical shift. In monastic life, humans had obeyed bells to regulate spiritual discipline. In medieval cities, public clocks coordinated civic life. In factories, the industrial bell dictated labor, social organization, and even perception itself. Humans were now measured, monitored, and shaped by externalized time on an unprecedented scale. Yet even as obedience increased, tension persisted. Natural instincts, bodily needs, and personal perception did not vanish. Humans learned to navigate the conflict between their internal rhythms and the external demands of standardized time. Fatigue, illness, and social pressures created friction within the rigid framework. Compliance was not absolute. Adaptation required creativity, resilience, and ingenuity. The Industrial Revolution, therefore, offers a stark lesson. Once life is measured, segmented, and standardized by external signals, human behavior, consciousness, and even society itself begin to change. Time becomes a tool of coordination, control, and moral expectation. Humans internalize mechanical rhythm, and perception itself is reshaped. Looking back, one realizes that the factory bell did more than regulate labor. It trained humans to live in measured intervals, to prioritize obedience, and to experience life through externalized time. Natural intuition and flexibility began to erode under relentless schedules. Daily existence was now orchestrated by a force beyond individual control, the standardized, mechanical clock. And yet, the lingering question is unavoidable. As society continues to submit to ever more precise, pervasive, and personal measures of time, what is lost in our perception, creativity, and natural rhythm? How much of life becomes a response to the clock, rather than an engagement with lived experience? The Industrial Revolution did not answer this question fully. It only set the stage for the modern world, where humans continue to negotiate the tension between mechanical time and natural life. Story 8: Standard Time and the Railways, Synchronizing a Nation. Before the 19th century, time was local. Each town, village, and city followed its own solar clock. Noon was when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. If you were traveling from one village to another, local time could shift by minutes or even an hour, depending on longitude. This system worked well when movement was slow and daily life was structured around natural cycles. But when the railway arrived, carrying people and goods at unprecedented speed, the old system became unworkable. Imagine a traveler in 1840s England trying to catch a train. The timetable lists departure at 12:15 p.m. But which noon is that? The local noon in London differs from that in Birmingham. With trains crossing multiple towns in hours, passengers risked missing connections simply because each town's clocks disagreed. Collisions became a genuine threat as railway operators struggled to coordinate schedules across multiple local times. The very promise of speed exposed the fragility of localized timekeeping. Railway companies faced an existential problem. Without standardized time, efficiency, safety, and reliability were impossible. Trains were faster than horse-drawn coaches, but their speed amplified every discrepancy in local clocks. Station masters and engineers were forced to rely on personal judgment, which was imprecise. Minor timing errors could cascade into disastrous delays, miscommunications, or even accidents. Time, previously a matter of observation and local consensus, had suddenly become a national concern. The solution came gradually but decisively: standardization. Railway companies, particularly in Britain, proposed a uniform railway time that synchronized stations and schedules across regions. Noon was no longer dictated by the sun at each town, but by a single agreed-upon standard, often based on the time in London. Towns were asked to adjust their clocks to align with railway schedules. This marked a profound shift in human perception. Time was no longer local or flexible. It was uniform, transmitted across distances, and imposed for practical purposes. For ordinary citizens, this change was both practical and disorienting. Merchants and travelers had to reconcile local tradition with railway standard. Church bells, civic clocks, and market schedules had to be recalibrated to align with the new time. Imagine a village accustomed to setting church noon by sunlight, now required to ring bells at a time dictated by London. The communal sense of natural rhythm began to bend to mechanical standardization. Railway companies were relentless. Efficiency, safety, and profit demanded synchronization. Station masters kept detailed schedules, adjusted clocks meticulously, and trained personnel to operate according to railway time rather than local sun. The bell, the whistle, and the timetable became the new arbiters of punctuality. Human behavior, previously attuned to daylight and local custom, was now disciplined by an external, standardized temporal authority. The social impact was immediate. Urban centers adapted quickly, aligning public clocks, market schedules, and school hours to railway time. Rural areas resisted longer, clinging to local solar time, but eventually even the countryside adopted the standard to remain connected to commerce and communication networks. Standard time transformed the experience of distance and speed. A journey that once felt long and indeterminate could now be measured, predicted, and scheduled. Communication also changed. Telegraph lines, which often ran alongside railways, depended on synchronized time for messages to arrive correctly. Trains and telegraphs became intertwined, both reliant on the precise coordination that standard time allowed. Humans were now living in a web of temporal interdependence. Missing a bell, misreading a clock, or misunderstanding railway time could disrupt work, travel, and commerce. Interestingly, this was not merely a technological adjustment, it was cultural. People had to adapt psychologically to the abstraction of time. It was no longer experienced as a natural phenomenon or local custom, but as a standardized, measurable resource. Time became a shared construct enforced by instruments and institutions, shaping perception, behavior, and expectations. And yet, tension persisted. Local traditions and natural observation had not disappeared. Humans still measured life by sunlight, shadow, and natural rhythm. Standard time imposed itself upon society, but humans had to negotiate between the old and the new. The result was a hybrid consciousness, one that recognized natural cycles but obeyed mechanical authority. The arrival of standard time marked a turning point in history. Humans were no longer free to experience time purely as they chose. Across entire regions, lives, work, and travel were synchronized to a uniform, external authority. It was a practical necessity, but it also represented a subtle surrender of autonomy. Individuals began to live not in sunlight, but by the authority of the clock, and that authority was now extended over nations. As trains sped across the countryside, the bell and the standardized clock reshaped perception of space, distance, and human agency. People now experienced the world in coordinated intervals, predicting arrival, departure, and duration with mechanical certainty. Life had become simultaneously faster, more precise, and more regulated. And so the question arises, when time becomes standardized across regions and enforced by technology, how does human perception adapt? Does intuition survive, or do humans begin to experience life primarily through the lens of schedules, measurements, and external authority? The answer, as the next decades would reveal, would continue to redefine society, work, and the very sense of what it means to live in time. After railway companies in Britain established railway time, the idea of a uniform clock gradually spread across the nation and later, the globe. Standardization was no longer merely a tool for efficient transport. It became a social, economic, and cultural necessity. Towns, cities, schools, and businesses began aligning their daily routines to the authority of the centralized clock. Time, once local and flexible, was now national, enforced, and predictable. In urban centers like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the adoption of standard time was relatively smooth. Public clocks were recalibrated, markets adjusted opening hours, and schools scheduled lessons to coincide with railway timetables. Bells that once rang at local noon now followed the new standard, aligning communities with the broader social network. Citizens learned to live by clocks that no longer reflected the sun's position, but the centralized temporal authority emanating from the railway system. Rural adoption was slower and sometimes resisted. Villages continued for years to set local noon by sunlight, particularly for agriculture, which relied on natural cues. Farmers measured day length, temperature, and seasonal progression rather than a mechanical clock. Yet over time, even remote areas recognized the benefits of synchronization. Mail deliveries, trade, and transportation required alignment with standardized schedules. The human experience of time began shifting from subjective and local to uniform and socially mandated. This shift had economic consequences. Markets became more efficient as merchants and traders coordinated transactions across towns. Production and shipment schedules became predictable, reducing delays and disputes. Standard time enabled long-distance commerce to expand, connecting regions in a temporal network that transcended geography. People's daily lives were increasingly structured by the need to meet standardized intervals rather than by personal or environmental judgment. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Humans began to experience time less as a natural phenomenon and more as an external, measurable resource. People planned their activities to align with standardized hours, internalizing the clock as the primary organizer of daily life. Punctuality became not only a practical concern, but a social expectation. Arriving late was no longer a minor inconvenience. It signaled unreliability, disrespect, or incompetence. Life was being disciplined by a concept that existed independently of the individual: time as standardized measurement. Transportation networks further reinforced this shift. Railways extended synchronization over vast distances, with timetables requiring precise coordination between stations hundreds of miles apart. Telegraph lines often operated alongside railways, using synchronized time to ensure that messages arrived at predictable intervals. Humans were now participating in a system of temporal interdependence, where individual schedules were embedded in a broader network of coordinated action. Education and social life followed suit. Schools began scheduling lessons by the hour rather than by flexible natural cycles. Public institutions, workplaces, and even leisure activities adjusted to the standardized framework. Communities internalized this external authority, learning to anticipate, obey, and coordinate with mechanical time. Children grew up understanding minutes and hours as fixed units, aligning behavior with social, economic, and technological expectations. Standard time also introduced new hierarchies of temporal literacy. Those who could read, interpret, and plan according to the standardized clock were better positioned to thrive in commerce, transportation, and governance. Punctuality became a marker of competence and social standing. Conversely, those less attuned risked exclusion or inefficiency. The uniform clock reshaped not only perception but opportunity, creating a temporal economy as powerful as any financial system. Culturally, humans were learning to experience life in intervals. The elasticity of natural time, once measured by sun, shadow, and season, was replaced by strict, predictable hours. Communities negotiated between traditional temporal markers and the standardized clock, creating hybrid practices that gradually favored uniformity. Social rituals, festivals, and work schedules all began to respond to the authority of mechanical and railway-imposed time. Yet resistance remained subtle but persistent. Farmers, artisans, and some rural clergy continued to observe natural rhythms. They measured day length, monitored seasonal change, and observed celestial cycles. Even in industrializing cities, sundials and local clocks occasionally lingered. Humans retained the capacity to perceive time through natural cues, even as standardized schedules dominated daily life. The adoption of standard time highlights a fundamental shift in human consciousness. Time, once an observed phenomenon, had become a uniform external authority regulating life across regions. The railway bell, the synchronized clock, and the standardized timetable collectively imposed a new temporal reality, reshaping work, social interaction, and perception itself. And yet, even as society adjusted, the tension between natural perception and mechanical enforcement persisted. How would humans navigate a world where time was external, precise, and uniform? Would intuition, flexibility, and natural rhythms survive under the pressure of standardization? Or would life increasingly be experienced as a series of scheduled intervals? This question would shape the coming decades, influencing labor, leisure, and even human psychology in ways that are still felt today. By the late 19th century, standard time had firmly taken hold across Britain and much of Europe. The chaotic patchwork of local solar time had been replaced by a uniform temporal framework that governed work, travel, commerce, and social life. Railway companies, once pioneering synchronization for practical reasons, had become the agents of a cultural revolution. Humans were now living under a shared, standardized clock. Imagine a traveler in 1880s London preparing to take a train to Edinburgh. The timetable, printed and distributed months in advance, provides departure and arrival times to the minute. Every station along the route has clocks calibrated to the same standard. Conductors, passengers, and local businesses all operate within this unified framework. There is no ambiguity. No town sets its own noon. Life is disciplined by the authority of a clock that exists beyond the local environment, beyond natural observation, and beyond human discretion. For ordinary citizens, this transformation was profound. Daily routines, meals, work, school, and leisure became increasingly coordinated with the standardized schedule. Shops opened and closed according to train arrivals and market hours. Mail, communication, and business transactions were synchronized across regions. People internalized the rhythm of the clock, aligning personal activities with an external authority. Punctuality was no longer optional. It became a social expectation, an ethical and practical necessity. Railways were not the only institutions reshaping time. Factories had long enforced standardized hours, and urban governments now synchronized public clocks to railway time. Schools taught children to read clocks and organize their lives according to hours and minutes. Even recreational events, fairs, concerts, and theater performances adjusted to a society increasingly disciplined by uniform time. Across the nation, the bell, whistle, and mechanical clock imposed a new order on human experience. The psychological consequences were significant. Humans were learning to perceive time externally, to anticipate events according to a uniform measure, and to organize their attention and effort around an artificial rhythm. Daily life was no longer guided primarily by natural cues, sunlight, seasons, or tidal changes, but by an abstract shared authority. The uniform clock had become a mental as well as physical framework, shaping expectation, attention, and perception. Economic life was transformed. Standardized time enabled long-distance trade, efficient transportation, and coordinated labor. Factories could operate across regions, railway schedules allowed the rapid movement of goods, and merchants could plan transactions with reliability previously impossible. Time became a resource, a currency, and a tool of efficiency, shaping behavior across social, economic, and geographic boundaries. Yet the imposition of uniform time was not without tension. Rural populations, accustomed to natural rhythms, often found the new order alien. Even in cities, humans negotiated between intuition and authority, adjusting sleep, work, and leisure to conform to schedules that were externally imposed. The tension between natural perception and standardized enforcement remained an underlying current, shaping the evolution of modern life. The triumph of the clock illustrates a profound historical principle. Human societies can be coordinated and disciplined through externalized time. The railway, in concert with factories, schools, and municipal authorities, transformed time from a local observation to a national standard. Human behavior, consciousness, and social organization adapted accordingly. Life was measured not only in days or seasons, but in minutes, synchronized across towns, regions, and even nations. Culturally, the consequences were subtle but lasting. Shared temporal experience facilitated communication, commerce, and civic coordination. Citizens learned to plan, anticipate, and obey schedules with remarkable precision. Communities internalized external authority, and humans became capable of operating within complex, synchronized systems. The perception of time itself was transformed. It was no longer elastic or local, but standardized, quantifiable, and universally enforced. The spread of standard time laid the groundwork for modern temporal discipline, from industrial labor to global communication networks. It illustrates a recurring historical theme. Humans gradually surrender intuitive, natural perception of time in favor of externalized, mechanical authority. Monastic bells taught obedience within cloisters. City clocks coordinated urban life. Railway time synchronized regions. Each step extended the influence of structured time, preparing society for the technological, social, and economic transformations of the 20th century. And yet, even as clocks and schedules dominated, humans retained the capacity to observe natural rhythms, negotiate flexibility, and innovate within constraints. Life was being measured, coordinated, and disciplined, but it was never entirely dictated. Standard time became a framework rather than a prison, guiding behavior while leaving space for adaptation, creativity, and human judgment. As trains sped across landscapes, linking cities and regions, as public clocks ticked in unison, and as people internalized standardized hours, one realizes that this was more than a technical adjustment, it was a cultural transformation. Humans had begun to live according to a temporal authority far larger than themselves, extending over nations, regions, and institutions. The perception of life itself had shifted. No longer solely a matter of natural cycles or local observation, existence was increasingly synchronized, measurable, and disciplined by the authority of the clock. And so the question remains, as humans continue to internalize standardized time, to obey bells, whistles, and timetables, what is lost, and what is gained in the human experience. The story of standard time is a story not just of trains and clocks, but of consciousness, society, and the ever-shifting balance between autonomy and discipline.